What if the very first breath of life was less a gasp and more a patient, incremental exhale? An almost inaudible chemistry that stretched across eons. That question hangs over the earlier scenes, not as a literal sound, but as an image. A single membrane trembling at the edge of a warm, indifferent ocean, and within it the fragile possibility that chemistry had crossed into something that could be called alive. The Earth had just stopped being a brute of molten rock and furious storms. Its surface cooled, seas pooled, and the planet settled into a rhythm that would allow complexity to persist. In that liminal period, life did not arrive as drama, it arrived as repetition and as persistence. The earliest actors were not grand beasts, towering and conspicuous. They were small, almost epiphenomenal, single-celled forms adrift in the world's first blue cradles. They had no bones to hold them upright, no eyes to see the world around them, no brains to construct meaning from it. Yet, in their anonymous existence, they carried within them the seeds of every later story. The ocean, in those long first chapters, read like a chemistry book. Lipids, the kind of greasy molecules that today make up cell membranes, gathered on the surfaces of tiny puddles and pools. Under the steady play of sun and tide, they arranged into bilayers, spheres, and hollowed bubbles. Simple enclosures that could hold molecules together, separate inside from outside, and begin to concentrate reactions that would have been impossible in the infinite dilution of open water. These protocells were not thinking agents, they were plausible scaffolds. Yet to the historian of life, they were as consequential as any founding myth. In a single expanded scene, imagine a shallow pool. It is not painted as serene, it is gritty with mineral dust, hot with recent volcanic breath, and paradoxically patient. Lipid molecules, jittering with thermal energy, align themselves into a thin film. A gust of wind tilts the surface. A shard of rock dislodges a cluster, and a tiny vesicle gently folds itself away from the chaos, closing upon salts and nucleotides. Inside, the concentrations of certain molecules rise above the background. Nucleotides, perhaps stray RNA fragments, find one another more often. A strand forms. It is imperfect, prone to breakage, and yet it replicates, clumsily, without proofreading, a stuttering echo of a code that will become more exact with time. Each successful replication is a small victory against dissolution. That smallness is essential. The earliest life forms were not already adapted, they were experiments in persistence. They were governed by chemical affinities and by energy gradients. Their movements, if one can call them that, were the result of diffusion and of the slow pull of environmental cycles. Tides washed in nutrients, day warmed the shallow seams, night dropped temperatures and changed reaction rates. The narrative of emergence is full of such mundane cycles elevated to cosmic importance. A tide could be a selective pressure. A prolonged dry spell could concentrate solutes and force new chemistry. Over the vast canvas of deep time, these repetitive, small events accumulated into direction. One must linger for a while on the antagonists of this early world: entropy, dilution, and the relentless churn that would dissolve order as quickly as it formed. Life in its infancy learned to exploit narrow refuges, mineral surfaces that catalyzed reactions, the thermal gradients near hydrothermal vents that provided steady energy, pockets of organic-rich foam where molecules could meet without dispersing. The narrative is not of heroic individuals, but of niches. Tiny worlds within worlds where chemistry found leverage. A key tableau unfolds around the idea of energy harvesting. In the sunlit upper layers of the ancient ocean, certain molecules found an advantage in capturing sunlight. These were not organisms with chloroplasts, but pigment-bearing complexes that could funnel photons into chemical bonds. Over millions of years, the lineage that would become photosynthetic life refined this trick. Cyanobacteria, little sheets of microbial communities, began to harness sunlight and release oxygen as a byproduct. They had no lungs, of course, but they exhaled to the atmosphere in a biochemical sense, altering the planet on a geological timescale. The Great Oxygenation Event deserves to be rendered in slow motion. For a long interval, oxygen was a rare artifact, consumed almost immediately by reactive iron and other reduced materials. Then, inexorably, oxygen began to accumulate. Iron in the seas rusted into banded iron formations, and minerals that once absorbed oxygen became exhausted. The air itself started to change. Suddenly, a gas that had been toxic to many of the planet's early inhabitants began to saturate the world. To some of those primitive anaerobic microbes, the rise of oxygen was akin to the arrival of a new predator. It was a force that could damage delicate biochemical machinery. Many lineages perished. This conflict between the metabolic creativity of photosynthesizers and the vulnerability of anaerobic life was less a moment of drama and more a prolonged reweaving of the biosphere's fabric. That reweaving is where complexity takes its first major breaths. Single-celled organisms began to interact not merely as isolated reactors, but as participants in communities. Biofilms formed on stromatolites, layered, lithified structures built by microbial mats trapping sediment. These living carpets grew upward, drawing light and laying down mineral layers that would fossilize through ages. The site of stromatolites in the fossil record is nothing less than a petrified chorus of the planet's earliest ecosystems, silent, inhuman, yet populous. Each layer is a record of metabolic exchange, carbon fixed from the air, electrons shuffled across membranes, cellular remains cemented into rock. Viewed as a scene in a documentary, the stromatolite is both monument and archive. Another major transformation starts not with grand leaps, but with intimacy, endosymbiosis. Through the lens of the narrator, this moment reads like a dangerous and accidental alliance. One cell engulfed another, probably as a meal at first. Instead of digesting the swallowed organism, the two became partners. The captured cell, perhaps a proteobacterium, found a stable environment within its host and began to contribute energy in return for shelter. Over time, this arrangement solidified into mitochondria, the powerhouses that would enable cells to grow larger, specialize, and eventually cooperate at higher levels. The story here is not of design, but of mutualism emerging from desperation and necessity. The choreography of membranes folding, invaginating, and integrating over millions of years is a slow, majestic process more akin to geology than to the sudden epiphanies of myth. From the vantage point of the deeply patient narrator, multicellularity reads like a social innovation rather than a technological upgrade. Cells that once drifted alone began to stick together to share resources and to divide labor. Some became support structures, others reproductive, others sensory precursors. There were no brains in these arrangements, but there was communication, chemical signals, gradients, and feedback loops that coordinated behavior. The earliest multicellular arrangements were fragile collaborations, easy to break, easily toppled by change. But when they persisted, they opened new evolutionary avenues. The real power lay in the distribution of function, where once a single cell had to perform all tasks, now different cells could optimize. That division of labor laid the groundwork for tissues, organs, and the later, much louder songs of complex animals. Throughout these developments, the underlying rhythm remained cyclical, patient, and brutal. Mutation, selection, chance, and catastrophe conspired to prune and to diversify. The primitive seas hosted an ever-shifting cast of microbial forms, some motile, propelled by slender flagella, others stationary, anchored to rocks, others forming filamentous chains that could reach up toward light. Sensory precursors were born in reaction to gradients, chemicals diffusing, light intensity shifting, temperature changing. These were not sensors as humans know them, but they were the first hints of environmental perception. A cell detecting a favorable nutrient patch and biasing its motion toward it. The narrative here is less about invention and more about exploitation. Each tiny advantage, when repeated across millions of individuals and eons, compounded into adaptive complexity. There is a philosophical dimension to this long, quiet saga. The early biosphere teaches a lesson in scale and in humility. To be alive in those times was to participate in a slow, cumulative insurgency against entropy. The most consequential developments were not those that made life more spectacular in the short term, they were those that altered the planet's operating conditions. Photosynthesis did not merely create new organisms, it rewired the atmosphere and thereby reset the constraints for everything that followed. Endosymbiosis did not produce animals in a day, it furnished cells with efficient energy conversion, enabling the complexity necessary for later bodies. These were acts of planetary engineering, but executed without foresight or intention, mere consequences of persistence and chemical possibility. If one must anthropomorphize cautiously, the emergent emotional tone of this epoch is not joy or triumph, but a kind of relentless curiosity. Life, in its earliest manifestations, was blind to purpose yet inexorably exploratory. It probed niches, tried metabolic experiments, and sometimes failed spectacularly. Mass extinctions are an old story. In the oxygenation event, for instance, many anaerobes faced an environment that had become actively hostile. Those that survived either retreated to anaerobic refugia or adapted metabolically. The survivors, those that inherited the world after such upheavals, were not winners because of design, but because of resilience. In theatrical terms, these scenes are intimate rather than cinematic. There are no dramatic confrontations of leviathans tearing at one another. Instead, the tension arises from the interplay of tiny processes, repeated endlessly. A strand of RNA forming and breaking, a lipid bilayer folding and sealing, a pigment molecule capturing a photon and passing its energy along a chain. The drama is slow, cumulative, and discrete. That very slowness creates suspense. It forces the viewer or the listener to scale down their expectations and to appreciate the power of incremental change. Towards the end of this first chapter, the narrator widens the perspective. The small membranes, the pigment molecules, the mats of cyanobacteria, each represents a decision point in Earth's long narrative. Some branches closed, others led to the flowering diversity of life that would eventually include creatures with skeletons, with eyes, with nervous systems that could dream. But none of those later forms would exist without the patient, unglamorous work done by microbial predecessors. The chapter closes as it began, with an image rather than a spectacle. Picture, if one must, a single sheet of microbial mat undulating in a shallow sea as the sun arced overhead. Beneath it, chemical gradients shift subtly. The mat traps sediment, lays down minerals, and, over time, is pressed and fossilized. A future geologist will hold that rock and not, at first glance, perceive the living choreography it encodes. Yet it is a fossilized breath, an early exhalation locked in stone. That image links the ephemeral with the permanent, the microscopic with the geological. It is a quiet punctuation. The first breath was taken, the atmosphere was altered, and the stage was set for all futures. The narrator's final note in this segment is an invitation. What appeared as unremarkable chemical happenstance yielded a biosphere capable of producing architecture, sensation, and eventually culture. The story is not yet dramatic in form, it is a scaffolding. But scaffoldings matter. They are the prerequisites of worlds. And so, as the first chapter of this deep time documentary ends, the listener is left to absorb the paradox. How something so humble, so unnoticed, could be so fundamentally transformative. The first breath of life was neither triumphant nor particularly loud. It was patient, persistent, and, given enough time, irrevocable. What if the most consequential moment in the history of life was not a single invention, but the sudden widening of a theatre, an invitation to movement, sight, and conflict? That question sits at the heart of the Cambrian chapter, not merely that organisms multiplied, but that the very rules of interaction changed. For 500 million years and more, life had been mostly a chemistry of small things. Then, roughly 541 million years ago, something like a curtain lifted. The shallow seas filled with bodies that had edges, armor, eyes, and the neural scaffolding to move them with intention. The stage, once almost molecular, became anatomical. From the deep, omniscient vantage, the Cambrian explosion reads like a crescendo that had been prepared for hundreds of millions of years. The planet's chemistry had been slowly rearranged. Oxygen, once a trace and then a growing presence after the long work of photosynthesizers, had reached levels that would allow tissues to metabolize rapidly enough to sustain larger, active bodies. Mitochondria. Those ancient endosymbiotic acquisitions had been refining energy conversion for eons, turning small metabolic winds into the possibility of sustained motion and costly tissue like nervous matter. The genetic toolkit was in place too. Regulatory genes capable of orchestrating segments of body and producing repeating units, limbs, and heads. What was lacking was the ecological pressure that would push complexity into full expression. Then, in a planetary wink, that pressure arrived. The Cambrian seas were noisy in a way that the earlier world had never known. Noise here meant interaction, 1,000 different ways of touching, scratching, eating, escaping, and probing. Once the first truly effective predators arose, selection accelerated. Predation is not merely the subtraction of one individual from a population, it is a force that remolds the entire landscape of form and behavior. In evolutionary terms, the first effective hunters were catalytic. Their presence made sensing and speed valuable in new ways and favored innovations that had previously been marginal. Shelled exteriors, hard spines, and articulated limbs suddenly had utility beyond mere structural variation. They became defenses, instruments of pursuit, and tools for exploitation. Imagine a sweeping camera through a Cambrian shallow, beds of soft mud mottled with impressions, carpets of microbial mat interrupted by the scars of movement. There are forms that glance across the substrate, leaving ripple-like tracks, and forms that probe upwards, tentacles or flap-like lobes stirring the water as if testing it. Others bear plates that catch the light like scales, or chisels that scavenge and tear. The image of a world waking to the possibilities of form is apt because, in many ways, this is what the Cambrian is. A rapid exploration of morphospace, a proliferation of anatomical experiments. Some of these experiments lead to major branches that survive into the present. Others are eccentric lineages that flare brightly in the fossil record and then vanish. Among the evolutionary innovations that made this period feel revolutionary, 2 extraordinary developments deserve emphasis. The evolution of hard parts and the evolution of eyes. Hard parts. Exoskeletons, calcified shells, mineralized plates serve several functions at once. They provide protection, they anchor muscles and allow for more refined locomotion, and crucially, they leave traces. Before hard parts, the fossil record is whisper-soft molecules and impressions that the geologic churn often erases. With mineralization, life began to carve itself into stone. The record becomes not a rumor, but a library. It is no coincidence that our understanding of the Cambrian explosion deepens with the very innovations that made it preservable. Eyes, though, are a different kind of revolution. The first eyes were humble, patches of light-sensitive cells, photoreceptors that could tell mere day from night or detect the shadow of an approaching object. Those simple sensors were useful, but they were only the opening act. Through iterative refinement, cup-shaped depressions that conferred directional sensitivity, lenses that gathered and focused light, arrays of repeated units giving wide-angle vision image, forming eyes emerged in multiple lineages. The appearance of vision rewired the ecology. Movement that had gone unnoticed could now be seen and anticipated. Camouflage and counter-camouflage evolved. Ambush and pursuit strategies proliferated. The selective landscape changed not just in magnitude, but in dimension. A predator that could see and a prey that could detect it set in motion feedback loops that favored speed, maneuverability, and coordinated neural control. Here, the story invites a reflection on the emergence of the brain. Nervous tissue is metabolically expensive. To invest in the construction and maintenance of neurons, an organism must reap behavioral dividends. Faster reactions, better integration of sensory inputs, or more nuanced motor control. The Cambrian world, thick with sensory opportunity, made those dividends far more accessible. Nervous systems expanded from distributed nets, simple arrays of cells that could trigger contractions or reflexes, to centralized ganglia and cephalized clusters that presaged true brains. Cephalization, the concentration of sensory and processing apparatus at one end of the body, is an innovation with cascading consequences. A head can lead, vision can direct, and limbs can respond in more sophisticated ways. This shift enabled coordinated predation, more complex escapes, and ultimately behaviors that required memory, decision-making, and the integration of multiple sensory streams. To portray this as a single linear achievement would be misleading. The Cambrian explosion was not the invention of brains as a singular event, it was the concerted amplification of nervous complexity across many lineages. Some organisms developed compact ganglia that coordinated rhythmic undulations. Others elaborated segmental nerve cords that enabled precise limb movement. Each incremental increase in neural wiring allowed new possibilities. More precise foraging, more elaborate mating displays, more effective building of shelters and burrows. Over evolutionary time, these small gains compound into cognitive architectures that would, much later, permit animals to manipulate their environment at scales hitherto impossible. The Burgess Shale and similarly preserved deposits are the documentary footage of that era. They capture not just the forms, but the interactions, predatory appendages, gut contents, and traces that suggest behavior. Fossils like these force a narrative tone that is both exhilarated and modest. Exhilarated because the records show a riot of forms, each an experimental answer to the evolutionary question of what can life do next. Modest because the Cambrian's inventiveness is rooted in contingent circumstances, oxygen thresholds, gene regulatory possibilities, ecological feedbacks. The proliferation of body plans was not an inevitable crescendo, but the outcome of particular conditions met at a particular point in geological history. That contingency is where the deep-time documentary voice grows philosophical. The Cambrian explosion teaches about the precariousness of innovation. So much of what looks like design is in fact the result of iterative tinkering, an assemblage of small advantages accumulating over long stretches. The rise of armor and eyes and rudimentary brains was not a march towards some preordained goal. It was the outcome of interacting pressures where one innovation opened opportunities for others. Hard parts permitted preservation. Preservation permits insight into the past, which in turn colors the narrative of causation. The relationship between form and function is reciprocal. Vision favored neither centralization. Neither centralization favored targeted predation. Predation favored protective structures and evasive behavior. There is drama embedded in the mundane. Movement takes on suspense when observed at the right scale. The quick flick of a limb, the moment a shadow crosses a light-sensing patch, the way an appendage tentatively probes a soft surface. These microscenes carry narrative weight because they are the vectors through which selection operates. The Cambrian is full of such tension, the kind that arises not from a single confrontation, but from the cumulative pressure of many small confrontations. Each encounter, each bite and missed strike, each incremental improvement in sensory acuity or defensive plating nudged populations toward new equilibria. The result is a cascade, a radiation of forms that diversifies body plans, ecological roles, and sensory strategies. The emotional tone the narrator cultivates is a mixture of awe and sobriety. Awe at the inventiveness of life confronting fresh possibilities, sobriety because those inventions are fragile, contingent, and often ephemeral. The Cambrian is as much a story of loss as of gain. Many of the novel experiments died out. Odd morphologies that left no descendants yet illuminated the extent of biological possibility at the time. Their fossilized remains are like sketches on a palette, showing colors and textures that the enduring lineages did not adopt. To watch the Cambrian through the fossil record is to learn humility before a catalogue of near misses. Yet in that flux, the foundation of later life becomes clear. The anatomical and neural architectures that first emerge in the Cambrian are the scaffolding for later sophistication. Heads concentrate sensory processing. Neural circuits coordinate limbs into locomotion. Hard parts enable new modes of feeding and defense. These are not small facts, they are the necessary conditions for later phenomena. Complex behaviors, social interactions, extended ontogeny, and eventual culture. The deep-time narrator will insist on one insight. The Cambrian is not simply a branching point on a tree. It is the moment when certain dimensions of possibility, sight, movement, centralized processing became widely accessible to life. Once those dimensions are in play, the evolutionary search space expands dramatically. That expansion invites the speculative impulse inherent in this documentary form. If the Cambrian established the physical and neural frameworks for later intelligence and sociality, then it also framed the limits of what would later be possible. The materiality of nervous tissue, constrained by energetics and by developmental pathways, set both opportunities and boundaries. The shapes that would later evolve, fins into limbs, mouths into manipulators, simple eyes into complex image makers, were not conjured from scratch, they were modifications of what already existed. The past, in this sense, is both prologue and constraint. The Cambrian chapter closes not with an apotheosis, but with an invitation to patience. The explosion was not the end of change, but the beginning of a different tempo of life. Faster, more interactive, more history-producing. Where earlier epochs recorded chemistry and slow shifts, the Cambrian introduces behaviors that write themselves into the fossil record with new clarity. It is a turning point in narrative scale. Evolutionary time, always vast, now contains within it shorter arcs, life histories, predator-prey cycles, local extinctions that play out within geologic intervals. In the end, the Cambrian's most resonant image is not a single creature, but a tableau of eyes catching light, of armored plates flashing in shallow waters, and of nerve bundles coordinating limbs with intent. These elements, hard parts, vision, nervous centralization, compose a new grammar of life. They are the structural clauses that would, over subsequent eons, be recombined into animals capable of building, of remembering, and of imagining. The narrator frames this not as triumphalism, but as astonished observation, that from the patient chemistry of the first chapter emerged a kinetic world, quick with sight and contact, that set the stage for all the later, louder acts of life's story. It was, in a sense, the world learning to look and to move in earnest. And once it could do both well, the consequences were as inevitable as they were unpredictable. The Cambrian was a beginning, not because it produced perfection, but because it produced the foundational tools, armor, eyes, nervous tissue, that would be recomposed, repurposed, and elaborated until organisms could not only react to the world, but plan within it. The next chapters will track how those basic innovations were taken up, lost, and reinvented, how nervous systems grew more elaborate, and how, over deep and patient time, the scaffolds first assembled in that burst would be woven into the tapestries of minds. What does it mean to be a master of a world that never sees the sky? The question hangs like a carved rune across the seafloor of the Ordovician and into the Silurian. An age in which mastery was not exercised by size alone, but by armor, by discipline, and by exquisite adaptation to currents the world could not change. In those long marine halls, dominion was written in calcite and chitin, in the geometry of compound eyes, in the choreography of moats and burrows. The oceans resembled not a single stage, but 1,000 micro-theatres, each with its own cast of specialists. Among them, one group cast the largest, most persistent shadow on the sediment: the trilobites. To understand what it meant to dominate, then, one must first appreciate the architecture of the seas. Continental shelves lay flooded beneath shallow, sunlit waters that stretched across vast paleo-equatorial plains. Nutrients, mobilized by tectonic run-up and the slow turnover of ocean chemistry, fed rich plankton blooms. The water column became layered with food webs, microscopic photosynthesizers at the base, filter feeders and grazers inhabiting the middle, highly mobile predators and scavengers patrolling the bottom. This stratification made the shallow marine world a place of intense interaction, a place in which ecological roles were as sharply delineated as the ribs on a trilobite's thorax. The Ordovician biodiversification event unfolded here not as a single explosion, but as a protracted enrichment. Lineages that had been experimenting in the Cambrian found ecological space to expand and refine. Brachiopods and bryozoans built lacework communities on the hard substrates. Crinoids erected feathery gardens whose stems and arms filtered particles from the water like static nets. Rugose and tabulate corals, along with sponge-like stromatoporoids, became architects of reefs, places of concentration and shelter where life could reach complexity by proximity. In such habitats, trilobites were everywhere, along the margins of reefs scouring algae, across muddy plains leaving long undulating tracks, and in sheltered burrows where molting could be performed under the protection of soft sediment. Trilobites deserve a particular attention because they embodied a suite of evolutionary solutions perfectly tuned to Ordovician circumstances. Their bodies were a sequence of articulated segments, each bearing a precise relationship to the others, flexible enough to allow enrollment, robust enough to anchor muscles for both crawling and digging. The exoskeleton was mineralized, often ornamented with spines and ridges. Those spines were not mere decoration, they were engineering responses to a world in which predators and environmental instability demanded multiple defenses. When a danger approached, a nautiloid with a jet-like propulsion or an armored arthropod closing in, the ability to fold into a near-impenetrable ball, tucking delicate appendages under articulated rings, was an evolutionary strategy of remarkable economy. Even the eyes of trilobites were instruments of domination. Unlike soft-patch receptors, many trilobite eyes were crafted from calcite crystals, each lens oriented with geometric precision across a convex surface. The compound eye offered a mosaic of light, shadow, and motion. It turned environmental gradients into actionable information. Where earlier life had relied on slow chemical sensing, the trilobite's vision permitted quick detection of shadows and shifts, a three-dimensional awareness that made both predator and prey activities more consequential. In evolutionary terms, eye structure turned the seabed into a stage where movement could be read and responded to with immediacy. The mechanical precision of calcite lenses is an index not only of capability, but of constraint. Mineral optics limited resolution yet provided durability, an investment in survivability across rough, grainy waters. Behavior, as paleontologists infer it from trace fossils, was where the drama of this age is most palpable. The preserved imprints, curving furrows of Cruziana, resting impressions of Rusophicus are not static images but scripts of action. They record the measured progression of a trilobite probing the substrate. Antennules sweeping for food, a sudden lift, a brief pause, the decisive backward kick of a swimmer evading a strike. To reconstruct these scenes is to feel the tension of a predator-prey game played at centimeter scales. The trilobite's life alternated between long stretches of routine, grazing, burrowing, shedding and regrowing armor, and the sharp interruptions of risk. The molting process itself was a ritual of vulnerability and renewal. To shed an old carapace was to leave behind a hollowed shell that might be taken by opportunistic scavengers. It was also to expose soft tissues that required hiding. Some trilobites retreated into self-dug chambers, while others relied upon the reflexive act of rolling up. Each molting event was a small crucible in which survival was tested. There is an economy to these scenes. The mainland narrative of the age is not one of heroic battles, but of countless microscopic gambits, each feeding event a negotiation, each burying an insurance policy against scarcity. Predation functioned as a crucible for innovation. Where a predator could pluck slow grazers from the substrate, selection favored escape speed and protection. The result was an arms race of sorts, thicker carapaces, extended spines, more acute sensory arrays. Armor became both passive and active technology. It allowed trilobites to occupy exposed substrates that less protected organisms could not, thereby giving them access to foraging niches with lower competition. But trilobites were not alone in mastering the seas. Nailed beside them in the catalogue of dominance were cephalopods, straight-shelled nautiloids that prowled the water column like living torpedoes. Their buoyant chambers and siphon-driven locomotion permitted rapid bursts of movement, and their beak-like jaws left marks in the fossil record. Telltale scars on shells, torn carapaces, gut contents frozen in time. These predators were, in an ecological sense, the selective engine behind many defensive morphologies. They were not omnipotent. Their own vulnerability to the vagaries of oxygen, food supply, and currents made their reign a contingent success. Other protagonists in this marine drama included the sessile filter feeders and colonial organisms that stitched together three-dimensional habitats. Bryozoan mats and brachiopod fields created textured seascapes. Echinoderms, especially crinoids, built forests whose detritus modulated sedimentation patterns and which in turn influenced the distribution of infaunal organisms. Graptolites, tiny colonial animals drifting in the water column, became the planktonic equivalent of the trilobites' benthic ubiquity, their saw-toothed stolons forming long chains that captured particulate food and served as prey for small predators. In this crowded, highly connected world, energy flowed through numerous conduits, and any alteration in one node propagated outwards. The intensity of ecological interaction in the Ordovician had another important consequence. It increased the chances of fossilization. Where habitats were rich and dense, so too were the opportunities for rapid burial and mineralization. Shelled organisms accumulated in layers. Reef frameworks trapped sediments, sudden storms, or turbidity flows. Buried communities in anoxic slurries, preserving them as snapshots. Thus the seas of mastery left a disproportionate record. The stratigraphic pages of these epochs read like a ledger of success. Diverse assemblages, repeated morphologies, geographic spread. Yet the arc of that ledger also hints at fragility. The end. Ordovician glaciation, one of the planet's great respiratory pauses, forced a pronounced recalibration. As sea levels fell with the growth of ice sheets, shallow epicontinental seas retreated, habitats contracted, and the specialized masters of the high shelves faced a sudden loss of stage. Many trilobite groups experienced severe declines, reef systems were decimated. The extinction was not indiscriminate, it pruned ecological specialists more heavily than generalists. In this pruning, the narrative demonstrates a recurring theme. Mastery is conditional. Dominance, arising from specialization, is potent. When conditions match the organism's toolkit, it becomes a liability when the world reconfigures. The Silurian, by contrast, tells a story of recovery and innovation. With the retreat of glaciers and the re-expansion of shallow seas, opportunities re-emerged, albeit in a world that had been rearranged. Reef building reasserted itself, but with new architects taking precedence. Coral stromatoporoid frameworks flourished, creating reef complexes that supported diverse communities. Crinoid meadows and bryozoan thickets became commonplace. In these resurrected habitats, trilobites persisted, but their dominance was tempered by the ascent of new forms. Jawless fishes diversified, and the first jawed ancestors, small, armored, and experimental, began to appear. The beginnings of a vertebrate presence, initially marginal in abundance, hinted at future shifts in the ecology of predation and mobility. Silurian seas also witnessed a subtle but profound change in the interface between life and land. Along tidal margins and damp sediments, simple plants, small vascular stalks, began to hold onto soil. They were not yet forests, not yet world changers in the way later terrestrial plants would be, but their presence signaled an expansion of ecological theatre. The coastal dynamics altered erosion and nutrient flow, and thus the composition of adjacent marine communities. The seas that had been masters on their own terms now found themselves in conversation with nascent terrestrial processes. In evolutionary time, these conversations would grow louder. The emotional texture the narrator cultivates in these episodes is one of careful admiration, shaded by an unflinching awareness of contingency. The mastery of trilobites and the complex architectures of reef communities are not triumphalist tales, but study cases. Examples of how life engineers dominance through morphological specificity and ecological integration. Yet mastery here is local, temporal, and vulnerable. Each epoch writes its own rules. Each rule can be overturned by shifts in climate, in chemistry, in the geometry of continents. To watch the Ordovician and Silurian through the fossil record is to learn that what looks like long success is often a delicate equilibrium maintained by permutations of circumstance. This lesson reaches beyond paleontology and into the speculative frame the documentary voice prefers. Mastery, whether biological, cultural, or technological, is rarely absolute. It is an emergent property that depends on the match between organismal design and environmental contingencies. The trilobite's calcite eyes, its rolling defense, its meticulously articulated segments, these were winning combinations for millions of years. They mapped onto the conditions of Ordovician shells with great fidelity, enabling the trilobite clades to diversify and to fashion the seafloor in their image. Yet, precisely because that dominion was so tightly coupled to specific conditions, it could be, and later would be, disrupted. To close this chapter is to attend to the quiet, counterintuitive paradox of deep time. Dominance leaves traces, but traces can mislead. The fossil record sings the praises of trilobites as masters of the ancient seas, but it also records their vulnerabilities. In sedimentary silence, one can read both the concentrated success of armored arthropods and the vulnerabilities that succession imposes. The Ordovician and Silurian, then, are not chapters in a story of inevitable progress. They are case studies in ecological competence and in the ephemeral victory of adaptation. As the scene dissolves, the narrator leaves with an image at once intimate and vast. A trilobite edging over a reef shadow, compound eyes catching a shifting light, legs stirring silt into filaments that drift like confetti. It is a small tableau, a fleeting event in a deep time ledger, but it carries within it a lesson about scale and transience. Mastery in the ancient seas was crafted not by dominion over all, but by exquisite fit to particular ways of being. The rocks that now hold those imprints retain both the record of success and the warning that time is patient. It repays none of its favourites indefinitely. What happens when the ocean learns to bite? That simple provocation frames the Devonian, the age of fish, not as a single invention, but as a wholesale reconfiguration of ecological possibility. For hundreds of millions of years, life had been reworking chemistry into form. Now those forms acquired tools to take, to crush, to seize. The consequences were structural. New feeding strategies carved new niches, and with each bite, the ocean's food webs were rewired. Predation became not an occasional hazard, but a pervasive shaping force, and that pressure expanded the range of biological invention in directions that had been, until then, barely contemplated. The Devonian seas were crowded with builders. Reefs rose like living cities, three-dimensional architectures constructed by corals, tabulate and rugose, and their companions, the rock-like stromatoporoids. These reef complexes were more than static assemblages of calcium. They were neighborhoods, marketplaces of biological exchange. In their crevices, microhabitats multiplied. Blind cavities held informal communities. Sunlit faces hosted algae and grazers. Overhangs sheltered larvae and juveniles. The physical complexity of reefs multiplied ecological roles, and where complexity increases, so does interaction. It was in and around these reefs that many of the most consequential transformations of the Devonian took place. Among the most conspicuous inhabitants of these seas were the nautiloids, evolutionary torpedoes, long, conical shells buoyed by subdivided chambers, their bodies withdrawn into a calcareous, shell-hosted siphons capable of jetting water with abrupt bursts. They were not merely predators by design, they were the first large, mobile hunters to patrol the water column with sustained power. Their beak-like mouthparts could nip soft tissues, their reach tentacles extended from the shell aperture could pluck and manipulate. The presence of such active hunters changed the calculus of risk on the seafloor and in the water above it. Sediment-dwelling organisms adopted defensive postures. Armored carapaces became more valuable, and escape, swift, directed locomotion was suddenly a trait with premium value. At the same time, a lineage of vertebrates that had begun as jawless, armored grazers and filterers diversified into forms that would profoundly alter ecosystems. The early jawless fishes, the ostracoderms, were encased in bony plates, slow-moving, and often benthic. Their bodies were engineered for protection and for scraping at microbial mats or sifting detritus. They were signs that the vertebrate body plan could be mineralized and scaled up. But the real watershed in vertebrate evolution was the emergence of jaws, an innovation with consequences that radiated outward like shock waves. The prevailing evolutionary narrative sees jaws as modified gill arches, structures that had once supported breathing apparatus now repurposed as grasping implements. This retooling was incremental, contingent, and profoundly consequential. A jaw is not merely a cutting edge, it is a limb for the mouth. It allows force to be concentrated, shape to be manipulated, and behaviors, biting, cropping, holding, crushing, to be invented. Once biting became feasible, new diets opened up. Hard-shelled mollusks could be cracked, mobile invertebrates could be seized, even the flesh of other fishes became a viable resource. Teeth, for so long the hallmark of later vertebrate success, are thought to have evolved from scale-like structures along the skin and jaw, tiny mineralized protrusions that were redeployed for repeated, forceful contact. The evolution of biting and the appearance of teeth expanded the adaptive landscape in ways that no previous innovation had matched. Armored placoderms embodied this new predatory logic. These fishes combined broad head shields with mobile jaw apparatus and, in some groups, startling specializations. Shearing plates, interlocking armor, and body plans adapted for both ambush and sustained pursuit. They were predators that could confront other armored forms, dismember prey, and exploit niches previously closed to tongueless mouths. Their successes are etched in the fossil record as diversity and as evidence of ecological pressure. Bite marks on shells, repaired fractures in armor, and stomach contents that revealed diets of surprise and variety. Concomitantly, the first sharks' primitive chondrichthyans emerged in the Devonian's underwater theatres. They carried a different suite of adaptations, cartilaginous skeletons light and flexible, rows of replaceable teeth, and hydrodynamic bodies suited for midwater cruising. Sharks and their kin exemplified another path to predatory efficiency, one less reliant on heavy plating and more on speed, endurance, and dental economy. Where placoderms often dominated structured benthic interaction zones, the sharks exploited open water opportunities, becoming important agents in the restructuring of mid-column food webs. Bony fishes, the ostichthyans, underwent one of the most dramatic radiations of the period. From this broad group, two major lineages emerged: the ray-finned fishes, actinopterygians, and the lobe-finned fishes, sarcopterygians. Ray-finned fishes would later become the planet's most speciose vertebrates, but in the Devonian, both lineages experimented with fin structure, skeletal support, and respiratory innovations. Lobe-finned fishes developed robust, muscular fins with internal bone structure, early, intimate analogues to the limb bones that much later would be pressed into service on land. Some of these fishes show hints of functional versatility, fins that could prop the body against the substrate or push through shallow water, bones that could support weight in a different medium. Others developed air-breathing capabilities, buoyant swim bladders that could be turned into primitive lungs in certain lineages, an example of physiological plasticity meeting ecological opportunity. This morphological diversification was not free-floating. It interacted with and often responded to a rich ecology of predators, prey and habitat engineers. Grazing fishes controlled algal growth on reef faces, keeping corals from being smothered. Predatory fishes regulated populations of smaller invertebrates, which in turn influenced sediment suspension and nutrient cycling. The Devonian Sea can be imagined as a network in which each node, each functional group, weighted and tugged at others. The emergence of biting mouths intensified these linkages. Where previously energy flowed primarily from producers up through a few filterers and grazers, now predation added a verticality and dynamism that reshaped energy throughput and the temporal cadence of population change. The rise of fish thus precipitated an evolutionary arms race. Armor became thicker, spines became longer, mobility became swifter, sensory systems, lateral lines, electroreception precursors, and more refined visual capacities became valuable. Predators developed specialization, crushers for shelled prey, pinchers for grasping nimble organisms, ambushers that could exploit the reef's chiaroscuro. Prey evolved behavioral responses, burrowing, schooling, nocturnal shifts, and refined life history strategies that distributed risk over space and time. These interactions amplified evolutionary tempo in places where it had once been measured and cautious. But the Devonian story is not one of unidirectional progress. It is also the story of how life's reach can provoke planetary feedbacks. On land, simple vascular plants spread across shores and floodplains. They were not yet towering forests, but their root-like structures bound soil and drastically altered weathering patterns. With the increased capture of soil and nutrient pools, runoff changed. Rivers carried large loads of phosphate and nitrogen into coastal seas. For reefs adapted to clearer, oligotrophic waters, this was a new stressor. Increased nutrient levels promoted algal blooms and turbidity, which smothered corals and disrupted the delicate symbioses upon which reef builders depended. These terrestrial-driven changes, along with episodic oceanic anoxia and shifts in sea level, played into a sequence of crises that collectively formed the late Devonian extinction pulses. The reef systems that had served as cradles of diversity were particularly hard hit. Coral assemblages collapsed in many regions, stromatoporoids declined, and the structured landscapes that had supported dense fish faunas fragmented. Placoderm diversity dropped precipitously, entire clades disappeared. Yet, as with many mass extinctions, loss and opportunity were entwined. The pruning effect removed dominant lineages, and within the surviving taxa lay both the raw materials and the ecological vacancies that would later be repopulated and reshaped. It is important to recognize the ambiguity in such events. Extinction is both an ending and a prelude. The same selective pressures that trimmed placoderm dominance allowed the less armored, more flexible actinopterygians and certain sarcopterygians to proliferate. Among the survivors were forms that had developed features pre-adapted to life at the water's edge: lungs, robust fins, and behaviors that could be co-opted for terrestrial excursions. In the long arc of deep time, the evolutionary experiments of the Devonian did not produce a straightforward ascension to land. They furnished a hematopoietic mix of traits, histories, and contingencies from which terrestriality could later be realized. Throughout this narrative, the emotional tenor is a mixture of marvel and humility. There is marvel at the repeated reinvention of form, how a gill arch can be remade into a biting jaw, how a patterned plate can become an armored head, how a fin can be proto-limb. There is humility in recognizing that these transformations were neither teleological nor certain. Predation did not push life toward intelligence or culture. It pushed it into niches shaped by risk and reward, by force and avoidance. The Age of Fish is, above all, a lesson in how functional novelty, jaws, teeth, propulsion, and bony skeletons can reshape an entire planet's ecological architecture. To close the Devonian chapter is to hold an image both intimate and portentous, a shallow channel where a half-buried skull plate glints in the warm light, a cloud of suspended sediment marking a scurry of little fins, and, beyond them, a lobe-finned silhouette propping itself against a muddy slope. There is no heroism in this scene, only consequence. The bite is a mechanical fact that cascades outward. It restructures food chains, reshapes habitats, and, in cumulative effect, alters the very potentials of life. The Age of Fish was not simply a proliferation of forms, it was the moment when active predation rewove the fabric of marine ecosystems, setting in motion evolutionary vectors that would later make the terrestrial world thinkable. If one must extract a moral in the narrator's tone, it is this: innovation in form, however small, however opportunistic, can have planetary reverberations. Teeth and jaws did not just allow certain animals to eat differently, they made certain ways of being possible, and in so doing they remade the stage on which later dramas would be played. The Devonian seas, bustling and brittle, taught that power often comes in the capacity to take, a lesson the planet would return to again and again in epochs yet unwritten. What would it take for a creature perfected for water to gamble everything on a breath of air? That question hangs like a quiet accusation over a shoreline in deep time, a ragged fringe where sea meets emergent green, where tides turn shores to mud and water to puddles, where the stakes of life were counted not in years but in the hours between rainstorms. It is an image of transition that is at once simple and enormous. A body half in, half out, a fin propping against slick rock, the thin film of skin resisting the sun. The conquest of the land was not a hero's march. It began as a series of small, dangerous experiments, and as with most true experiments, many of them failed. In the oceans that still held giants, armoured placoderms like Dunkleosteus, hulking, shearing mouths encased in bony plates. The rules were blunt and efficient. Power was mass and bite radius, a geometry of armour and leverage. Dunkleosteus could split the shells of armoured prey and left scars in the fossil record like punctuation marks on a sentence about force. Such masters of the Devonian Sea framed the cost of being terrestrial. The ocean was a place of obvious danger and even more obvious reward. To survive there demanded armour, speed, or cunning. To leave it required something more ambiguous, an ability to survive the equally unforgiving but differently dangerous world above water. The first steps onto land were not taken by those giants. They were taken by the small and awkward lobe-finned fishes with thick, muscled appendages and an appetite for risk. These were not amphibians in the human sense yet, but anatomical blueprints. In their bones there were hints of a future not entirely aquatic. Robust proximal elements, limb-like radials, joints that could bear weight in brief bouts, and a lung-like organ that could supplement oxygen uptake when gills were choked by hypoxic water. Lungs did not appear as a prediction of terrestrial life. They arose as a solution to aquatic problems: stagnant pools, oxygen-poor lagoons, and seasonal drying. A swim bladder useful for buoyancy could, under certain developmental tinkerings, become a primitive lung, useful for breathing air. Evolution repurposed what was at hand. The drama of this transformation is best narrated through a sequence of scenes, each a miniature economy of risk and innovation. First, a shallow lagoon after a hot day. The sun hangs heavy. Algal mats smother the shallows, dissolved oxygen declines. Tiny crustaceans gasp at the surface. A lobe-finned fish, accustomed to the security of current and depth, finds itself in a pool that will not hold oxygen through the night. Instinct, an imprecise word, but better than the sterile selection, alone biases it toward the surface. It lifts its head, its spirocular opening flickers, and it gulps a reluctant air. The lung expands like a balloon of compromise. Within that act is a compromise between water and air. Gills still functional, but an auxiliary system breathing air when water falters. Second, the tidal flat, expanse of mud exposed at low tide. Vegetation fringes the shore, primitive plants that root in trembling soil. The substrate is a mosaic of firm crust and soft ooze. Fins with strengthened lobes push against the grainy surface. Rays of fin rays spread like fingers, anchoring and levering. These postures are awkward and costly. The fish pant, water slakes its skin and prevents catastrophic drying for a little while, but the exposure is real. Muscles that once undulated to produce efficient swimming are retooled slowly into muscles that can sustain episodic weight bearing. Skeletal elements reorient. Pectoral girdles begin to dissociate from cranial support, allowing the head to lift and the trunk to bear load. Third, ephemeral pools separated by bars of sand. Here, isolation becomes selection. Populations trapped in shallow pools face a brutal filter. Either they adapt to oxygen fluctuations and the threat of desiccation, or they do not. Over generations, small anatomical shifts accumulate. Lungs become more vascularized, skin tissues thicken and secrete more mucus to resist water loss. Eyes adapt to the refractive difference between air and water, shifting focal planes and changing pupil behaviors. Nasal passages adjust. Interior openings that would later become choanae provide a way to take air into the mouth cavity without constantly surfacing. None of these changes is a revolution. Each is a modest nudge in a particular direction, and each gains value only in the local, contingent environment. There is no single moment one can point to as the step onto land. Rather, the conquest is a series of provisional attachments: a foot on soft mud, a brief stroll along the shore in search of prey or refuge, a night spent anchored beneath a log. The earliest true amphibians, forms that still required water for reproduction, yet could spend extended time out of it, carried within them both accomplishments and compromises. Their skeletons bore stronger ribs and vertebral elements to support axial load. Their pelvic girdles showed incipient anchoring to locomotor muscles. Their limbs, while still flipper-like, carried bones homologous to those of later tetrapods. Those bones did not arise by prophecy. They were the outcome of selective pressures acting on fishes that were already exploring the edges. The environment itself was an active participant in the story. Plants creeping onto land, small though they were, altered hydrology and sediment dynamics. Spore-bearing carpets held soil, reduced erosion, and created new microhabitats where moisture lingered. Insects and arachnids, arthropods already sophisticated in their own right, colonized the damp margins, offering a novel food resource for opportunistic vertebrates. The absence of large land predators opened niches that were, for aquatic forms, both an invitation and a trap. Safety from piscine bite often required exposure to desiccation and UV. The cost-benefit calculus varied with season, place, and chance. A fish that could snatch a cluster of insects from a shoreline might gain a caloric windfall. One that could not return to water before nightfall might become a fossil record of risk. Physiology tightened the narrative. Respiration provided a constant negotiation between viscera and surface. Early amphibians retained the buccal pump. a method of drawing air into the lungs by muscular action of the throat rather than the rib-driven ventilation that would evolve in some lineages later. Buccal pumping suited small bodies and intermittent air breathing, but it also demanded a reconfiguration of the cranial and buccal musculature and a trade-off with feeding mechanics. Skin, porous and wet, served as supplementary respiratory surface, enabling cutaneous gas exchange that bought these animals a margin of survival but tethered them to moist environments. Reproduction remained an aquatic affair. Eggs lacked shells and were vulnerable to drying, tethering life cycles to water bodies and ensuring that the conquest would be gradual and incomplete. The narrative tension is not just biological, it is ecological and philosophical. Leaving the sea entailed a move from a relatively homogeneous medium to an environment of radical heterogeneity. In water, a single set of forces, buoyancy, viscosity, dissolved oxygen, governed much of life's mechanics. On land, gravity had full effect. Microclimates varied over meters, and radiation from the sun demanded new protections. This required new solutions: keratinized skin for water conservation, changes in sensory systems to detect airborne cues, and behavioral innovations to exploit variable resources. At every turn, the cost of adaptation was the forfeiture of certain aqueous conveniences and the acceptance of new vulnerabilities. The conquest also had a political dimension in the deep-time sense. It remapped ecological relationships. New competitors and predators emerged on the margins. Insects, already diversified, presented both prey and challenge. Microbial decomposers colonized decaying carcasses, accelerating nutrient cycling at the land-water interface. Nutrient fluxes shifted as soils retained different materials. Rivers carried new loads into estuaries, altering the chemistry of coastal nurseries. The move onto land initiated an economy of ecological exchange that would increasingly bind terrestrial and marine systems together. Crucially, the amphibian phase was not an end, but a crucible. These pioneering tetrapods set the stage for later revolutions. Their partial embrace of terrestrial life created the conditions under which amniotes, animals that laid shelled eggs and freed their young from obligatory aquatic development, could later evolve. So, the conquest should be read as a long, experimental negotiation. Initial entries that probed, tested, sometimes failed, and occasionally led to lineage transformations. Each dapple on the shore was a seed thrown into a garden whose final shape could not yet be imagined. The deep-time narrator frames these moments with a tone at once reverent and wary. There is wonder in the anatomical improvisations. Limbs that became legs, lungs repurposed and refined, skins altered to fend off the drying sun. But underlying that wonder is a reminder of contingency. Much like Cambrian innovations or Devonian bites, the move onto land depended on a particular constellation of circumstances. Climate rhythms, coastal geology, the appearance of plants and arthropods, and the physiological quirks of specific clades. Had any of these components been significantly different? Had coastal waters remained well oxygenated year-round? Had plants failed to hold soil? The timing and trajectory of terrestrial conquest might have shifted, perhaps by tens of millions of years. There is drama to be found in the quotidian details: the anxious lift of a head to the surface, the first strong push of a fin against mud, the gradual strengthening of a bony structure that will one day be called a wrist. These are small actions repeated across generations and geographies, and their accumulated force is stupendous. They produce, in aggregate, a world in which the line between water and land becomes, for some creatures, negotiable. Yet the early amphibians did not yet possess the final keys to terrestrial independence. They were provisional residents of both media, at once creatures of water and of air held captive by reproduction and skin, advantaged by lungs but constrained by permeability. To close this chapter is to hold a composite scene, a shallow estuary at dusk, a lobe-finned shadow propped against a fallen plant stem, gills fluttering as it breathes in sudden precious air. Nearby, a patch of crusted mud where arthropods move like tiny, busy engines, the sky scoring the horizon in colors that aquatic eyes cannot fully decode. The conquest of land, the narrator would insist, began in these marginal, liminal places where life implicitly accepted compromise and where evolutionary audacity met environmental invitation. The first animals to leave the ocean did not storm a continent. They hesitated on its threshold, testing the grain of soil with fin and lung, rehearsing a kind of life that would take many more episodes of adaptation to become stable. In the long ledger of Earth's history, the amphibians occupy a chapter that is both tentative and foundational. They are the living proof that novelty often arises at edges, at the border of media, of climates, of ecological networks. Their story is not one of conquest in the imperial sense, but of slow accumulation and repeated trial. Time, after all, is the patient ally of those small, persistent experiments. The shore is where the sea and the land negotiated a new contract, and where life pressured, inventive, and never complacent found a way to broaden its possibility, if only a little at a time. What if the air itself became an agent of change? No longer only a medium to breathe, but a sculptor of body and behavior. That is the quiet, almost counterintuitive premise of the Carboniferous, an epoch in which the composition of the atmosphere reconfigured what life could be. In this chapter, the narrator dwells on a single provocative idea, one that reframes scale as a variable dependent not only on genes and ecosystems, but on the chemistry of the sky. For a time, oxygen rose to levels that the modern world would find almost intoxicating. And under that high, heavy breath, the arthropod bulklands expanded into an unfamiliar magnitude. The age begins with a landscape that is both lush and claustrophobic. Continental interiors had become a maze of warm, saturated wetlands, vast coal swamps where club mosses and giant horsetails towered in columns, and the first true trees knitted canopies so dense they threw deep green shadows. These were not temperate groves of measured light, but a riotous, soggy architecture of biomass. Trunks, buttressed by roots and subterranean rhizomes, leaves dripping, trunks exuding sap that would later become the strata of coal under pressure. The scene is not primarily about spectacle, it is an illustration of processes, a multiplication of photosynthetic surface pushing vast amounts of carbon from air into tissue, and in doing so, altering the atmosphere's chemistry in ways that mattered on a planetary scale. The narrator emphasizes contingency. The same processes that made the swamp's dense, rapid plant growth, slow rates of decomposition, also meant that organic matter was being buried faster than fungi and bacteria could recycle it. Lignin, rich tissues, novel in their complexity, resisted microbial attack. With decay impeded, peat accumulated, was buried and ultimately transformed by heat and pressure into coal. This geological sequestration of carbon had an atmospheric consequence. Oxygen built up. The planet's air became richer in free O2 than at almost any other time in its history. That surplus altered the physical environment in subtle and profound ways. Partial pressures of oxygen rose, making diffusion into tissues easier. For creatures constrained by tiny channels and passive diffusion, arthropods most notably, this biochemical generosity removed barriers that had previously kept body size small. Insects and their kin responded. The narrator avoids personification as a narrative crutch, but allows analogy the freedom to clarify. Arthropods, with their exoskeletons and segmented bodies, were evolutionary forms exquisitely tuned to a certain set of constraints. Their respiratory system networks of tracheae and spiracles diffused oxygen directly to tissues. In ordinary atmospheres, that diffusion is effective only over short distances. The geometry of tubes and gaps imposes a practical ceiling on how big an insect can be while still supplying oxygen to every cell. Raise the oxygen concentration, and those limits shift. The tracheal system can reach further by diffusion alone. Muscle tissues can be larger without being starved of gas. The result is not immediate genius, but a broadened morphospace in which gigantism becomes possible. Imagine a river corridor at dusk, the air swollen with humidity, the undersides of leaves shimmering with film, and across that humid stage the passage of wings larger than any born in modern skies. The narrator describes such moments economically but vividly. Dragonflies of the Carboniferous. Ancestral to the order Odonata include forms like the genus Meganeura, with wingspans approaching 75 centimeters. These are not exaggerated monsters in an adventure tale, but evolutionary expressions of a different physiological arithmetic. Wings that large shift the acoustic texture of a swamp. Wing beats are deep, slow thuds. The air is cut into broad sheets that stir hanging spores and droplets. The light through the canopy flashes across veined membranes, creating an almost cathedral-like kaleidoscope of shadow and shimmer. Flight in such conditions is less about aerobatic finesse than about an economy of flapping that trades speed for scale. On the forest floor, another spectacle unfolds. Arthropleura, a colossal millipede-like arthropod that could reach lengths of several meters. Its many-segmented body moves like a restless chord through the leaf litter, each leg a precise instrument in an enormous peristaltic wave. The narrator does not dwell on sensationalism. Instead, the scene is used to show the interaction of physiology, environment, and evolutionary opportunity. Arthropleura's size was enabled by the same atmospheric generosity that made Meganeura possible. Surface area to volume ratios and tracheal diffusion that would be limiting in today's air were far less so then. Moreover, in the dense understory of the coal swamps, large body size conferred distinct advantages: the ability to traverse flooded patches, to access decaying plant matter at scale, to deter predators through sheer mass. But gigantism also carried costs. Molting such a large exoskeleton was a vulnerability. The physiology of thermoregulation and growth demanded vast nutritional inputs, and locomotion through the saturated and complex terrain required compromises in speed and maneuverability. The narration lingers on detail, on the rasp of mandibles against decaying wood, on the sheen of cuticle under filtered light, on the way breath becomes a force that determines form. Yet the tone remains reflective. The Carboniferous giants are neither triumphalist nor tragic. They are contingent outcomes of an atmospheric experiment. The elevated oxygen that permitted larger bodies also increased the flammability of the landscape. The extremely oxygen-rich air turned sparks into conflagrations. Fires, once rare or transient, could sweep through the peat-rich understories with terrifying efficiency. Where high oxygen enabled life to swell, it also made landscapes prone to violent, catastrophic resets. The narrator frames this paradox as a moral-less lesson in trade-offs, an enabling condition that simultaneously amplified vulnerability. There are additional subtleties that the documentary voice explores. The development of forests and the sequestration of carbon did not only change oxygen, it altered hydrology and soils, which influenced river courses and coastal environments. Large terrestrial arthropods altered the structure of detrital cascades, grazing on fungi and decaying plants, fragmenting organic matter in particular ways, shaping microhabitats that facilitated or hindered microbial decomposers. The ecological networks of the Carboniferous were tightly coupled. The chemistry of the air, the architecture of plants, the physiology of arthropods, and the sedimentary processes that would print these interactions into coal seams all fed into one another. Change in any node could propagate widely. The narration stresses uncertainty. Gigantism, for all its drama, was not a permanent state imposed by evolution's hand. Geological evidence suggests that oxygen levels waxed and waned across the Carboniferous, and when they fell, physiological ceilings returned. The record offers a lesson in the reversibility of apparent progress. What looked like an unlocking of morphological possibility would later be constrained again by atmospheric shifts, by the arrival of new predators, and by the slow but inexorable changes in continental arrangements. The fossil record shows the rise and then the diminution of the largest forms, a cautionary echo of the deep-time logic that no ecological or physiological advantage is forever. Throughout, the narrator maintains a mood of humble astonishment. There is awe in the idea that the composition of the air could so dramatically change the possible sizes of life, and there is sobriety in recognizing how fragile those possibilities were. This duality is given texture through vignettes, micro-scenes that stress scale and temporality rather than individual drama. A juvenile arthropod sheds an exoskeleton and, for a few vulnerable hours, lies soft and exposed. A storm lifts and redeposits peat in a new layer, sealing a snapshot of a community beneath silt. A dragonfly, its wing torn by an unexpected predator, drifts to a reed and dies. Small events that, multiplied across millions of individuals and centuries, write the evolutionary ledger. The narrator also situates the Carboniferous within a larger planetary arc. The same mechanism that allowed insect giants and enormous millipedes, vast plant growth, and the burial of organic carbon had consequences far beyond the epoch. The sequestration of carbon altered greenhouse gas levels and thereby contributed to long-term climatic cooling that would, in later geological periods, permit ice ages. The interplay between biological innovation and geochemical feedback is a central theme. Life changes the planet, and the planet in turn changes the parameters under which life evolves. This recursive relationship is the narrator's philosophical anchor, an insistence that the history of life is never merely a catalogue of forms, but a bookkeeping of exchanges between biosphere and geosphere. There is a moral quality to the Carboniferous story, but it is not moralistic. It is a story about scale and contingency, about how a planet's atmosphere can tilt the conditions of possibility. It invites reflection on modernity as well. Contemporary oxygen levels are lower than those of the Carboniferous, and the giants of that age seem almost fantastical because the present chemistry of air and soil sets different limits. The narrator refrains from didactic parallels yet cannot avoid the resonance. A world's physical constants, its temperature, its atmospheric composition, the chemistry of its oceans, are constraints and opportunities. Evolution does not transcend them. It operates within them, exploiting margins and testing possibilities. The language of suspense used in previous chapters persists here. It is not a suspense of chase and conflict so much as a suspense about contingency. What will the next atmospheric shift do? Which innovations will be retained? Which will be pruned? The answer is slow and sometimes catastrophic. The Carboniferous ends not in a flashy extinction event, but in a series of slow adjustments and disruptive intervals. Fluctuations in oxygen and climate, tectonic reorganizations that change drainage patterns, and the gradual emergence of more efficient decomposers that begin to reduce peat accumulation. Each of these factors nudges the biosphere away from the conditions that favored the giants. In closing the chapter, the narrator offers an image that binds the intimate to the planetary. A cross-section through peat root systems intertwined like the veins of a vast organism and embedded within those layers the impression of a colossal arthropod track. Parallel lines carved into soft substrate, preserved by rapid burial and the patient chemistry of coal formation. Above, the air is heavy with oxygen. An ember from a lightning strike could, in moments, ignite a landscape that took millennia to amass. The image captures both the abundance and the precarity of the Carboniferous, an epoch in which size itself became a temporary answer to the question of how to occupy a world in flux. The narrator's final note is reflective, not conclusive. The age of giant insects is presented as a clear case of how planetary chemistry shapes biological possibility, and as an illustration of the recurrent lesson of deep time, that what looks like a new permanent can be a fleeting phase, and that innovation often arrives hand in hand with new vulnerabilities. The viewer or listener is left to hold the paradox in mind. The same air that allowed life to become prodigiously large also rendered the landscape combustible and the giants ultimately ephemeral. In the ledger of Earth's history, the Carboniferous is an extravagant, almost baroque chapter, lush, noisy, and full of bodies and breath, whose lessons are both scientific and quietly philosophical. It reminds the audience of scale, of urgency, and of the thinness of the conditions that make certain forms of life possible. The sky, the narrator concludes, is not merely a backdrop. In deep time, it has been a co-author. What happens when reproduction stops being tethered to water? What does the world look like once life learns to carry its nursery with it? That question frames this chapter, the quiet but seismic invention that allowed vertebrates to stop signing leases with ponds and puddles and to begin writing their histories inland. The first reptiles did not arrive as bold conquerors. They arrived as the inheritors of a different contract with the environment, one that replaced constant dependence on wetness with the ability to tote embryonic life inside a sealed, self-sustaining vessel. The amniotic egg, in its unassuming architecture, rewired the relationship between organism and land. The egg itself is an elegant solution, a miniature ecosystem wrapped in membrane and shell. To the paleontologist, this is not poetry, but anatomy. The amnion, a fluid cavity cushioning a developing embryo, the chorion, an outer membrane mediating gas exchange, the yolk sac, an enclosed larder, and the allantois, a receptacle for metabolic waste that also participates in respiration. Together, they form a portable womb, a closed cistern that keeps water and nutrients in, toxic byproducts out, and air exchange possible without drowning the embryo. It is a design that turns the problem of terrestrial reproduction into a solvable engineering trade-off. Unlike the gelatinous, water-dependent eggs of amphibians, amniotic eggs could be laid on dry ground, in leaf litter, under rocks, or in nests, any place that offered relative safety from flooding. This small change in packaging cascaded into a cascade of ecological and evolutionary possibilities. The conditions that favoured such an innovation were not mystical. They were mundane, geological, and climatic. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, continental rearrangements and climatic shifts produced increasingly arid interiors. The great coal swamps that had hosted amphibian profusions contracted, seasonal variability increased, ponds and ephemeral pools could no longer be relied upon as universal nurseries. Amphibious life found itself marginated, tethered to specific watery refuges, while pockets of terrestrial opportunity opened in soils, floodplains, and drying shorelines. In such a world, a reproductive strategy that insulated embryos from hydric uncertainty had enormous selective advantage. The amniotic egg, in a sense, is an evolutionary answer to desiccation, a portable nursery that could be placed wherever shelter, heat, and reduced predation allowed. But the egg did not appear in isolation. It came with a suite of accompanying innovations, an integrated shift in physiology and life history strategies that together let amniotes explore niches denied to their amphibian cousins. Skin that was less permeable to water, often scaled and keratinized, reduced cutaneous water loss. Kidneys and excretory pathways evolved strategies to conserve water. Nitrogenous waste was increasingly handled as uric acid or other low-solubility compounds, reducing the need to flush systems with water as amphibians do. Internal fertilization became the rule rather than the exception. A cloacal interaction ensured that sperm reached the egg inside the female's body, allowing eggs to be laid at a chosen place and time rather than forced into aquatic rendezvous. Limbs and girdle modifications, subtle at first, began to shift locomotion from sprawling, undulating progressions toward more efficient supports for life on firmer ground. Each of these shifts is small, but together they constitute a technological package, an organism no longer defined by its need to be near water. Fossils give us a checklist of these changes. The late Carboniferous yields bones of small, lizard-like creatures, amniotes such as Hylonomus, whose skeletal morphology hints at life spent mainly on land. Their limb proportions, vertebral articulations and skull forms differ enough from their amphibian predecessors to suggest different locomotor regimes and feeding strategies. Yet the amniote record is maddeningly sparse when it comes to direct evidence of eggs. Leathery shells and simple membrane-laden eggs do not fossilize as obligingly as mineralized shells. Much of what the narrative reconstructs is thus inferential. How these forms lived, where they nested, what pressures shaped them. That inference is not a weakness. It is the only available method for listening to the faint, patient voice of deep time. The ecological consequences of emancipating reproduction from water cannot be overstated. With their portable nurseries, amniotes could colonize floodplains, scrublands, and seasonal savannas, areas that had been inhospitable to life, needing constant water for breeding. It meant the occupation of higher ground, soils with different plant communities, and, crucially, territories where competition with water-bound amphibians was reduced. New diets became available. Tougher plant material, insect faunas specialized for drier conditions, and a range of arthropod prey that exploited different strata of vegetation. The ability to allocate eggs to protected nests also altered selective pressures on offspring mortality. Nesting behaviors, egg camouflage, selection for clutch size, and the development of life history strategies less tethered to aquatic larval stages. Where amphibians often required watery larval development, metamorphosis mediated by aquatic stages, early amniotes could hatch as miniature versions of the adult, bypassing a vulnerable, water-bound juvenile phase. The life cycle itself was slimmer, more terrestrial. From a larger phylogenetic perspective, that slender change opened a branching of deep consequence. The earliest amniotes diversified into two major lineages, the synapsids, which would give rise ultimately to mammals, and the sauropsids, from which reptiles and later dinosaurs and birds would evolve. The split is an early and crucial bifurcation, and it framed epochs to come. Synapsids quickly explored forms that ranged from small, agile insectivores to large, robust herbivores and apex predators of the Permian. Sauropsids likewise radiated into myriad body plans, some remaining small and agile, others expanding into different ecological roles. What unites these lines is not a single body plan, but a shared ecological liberty-freedom to reproduce and thus to spend more of the life cycle removed from the water's margin. This new freedom did not produce inevitable superiority. As with all evolutionary novelties, success was contextual and contingent. The move onto drier ground exposed organisms to new hazards. ultraviolet radiation, rapid temperature swings, and the constant threat of desiccation. Eggs had to be laid in substrates that moderated moisture and temperature. Nesting choices could mean the difference between a clutch that fledged and one that failed. In some environments, amphibians retained niches where their aquatic breeding strategies were still optimal: marshes, heavy canopy swamps, and stream margins. The ecological stage thus became more partitioned. Amphibians and amniotes shared landscapes, but often in different theatres of resource use. There is an ethical, less grandeur in this phase, the appearance of an innovation that was at once modest and revolutionary. The amniotic egg is not an act of foresight, but an opportunistic repurposing, developmental, physiological, and behavioral changes that together allowed new possibilities. The metaphor that often slips into narration is a dangerous one: technological emancipation, because it suggests design. But the truth is tinkering, genetic, developmental, and ecological forms that, when combined under certain pressures, yielded a tool that expanded the envelope of what life could do. In that sense, the first amniotes are less pioneers than beneficiaries of a confluence. Empty inland spaces, drying shores, and subtle anatomical shifts converged to make a new life strategy feasible. The fossil record of Permian ecosystems shows what that strategy produced. On vast Pangaean interiors, as climates grew more arid, reptiles began to dominate many terrestrial niches. Their scaly integument, efficient kidneys, and reproductive independence from water gave them advantages in open, seasonal landscapes. Synapsids, the so-called mammal-like reptiles of older literature, became diverse and ecologically significant. Some forms sprawling, others erect, some herbivorous, others carnivorous. Their success lasted across tens of millions of years, shaping continental ecosystems and creating the ecological dynamics that would be reset and reshaped by later catastrophes. Importantly, these shifts in dominance were not uniform across the globe. Geographic contingency, mountain ranges, river networks, paleolatitude, meant a patchwork of assemblages, each responding to local conditions. There is a paradox here that the deep time voice dwells on. Freedom can be limiting. The removal of an obligate aquatic reproductive stage allowed life to occupy places inaccessible before, but it also committed lineages to a novel set of dependencies. Egg incubation on land exposed progeny to new forms of predation, parasitism, and climatic risk. The reliance on harder, keratinized skin diminished avenues for cutaneous respiration, which in turn shaped activity patterns and thermoregulatory demands. Evolution trades: one constraint loosens, others tighten. The resilience of lineages thus depended on the ability to adapt to those new constraints, and the record shows a patchwork of successes, failures, and near misses. To visualize the scene is to hold several small images against each other: a clutch of leathery eggs nestled beneath a mound of damp leaves, an adult burrowing a shallow depression and turning back briefly, antennae-like sensibilities waiting for the safest moment, a newly hatched juvenile blinking into a world whose moisture gradients are different from those of its amphibian cousins, arthropods rustling and small predators probing at the fringes of a nest. None of these is cinematic in the Hollywood sense. They are domestic, intimate, and yet they embody a planetary shift. Each egg that survived to hatch carried with it a fragment of a new ecological future. The chapter closes with attention to continuity. The amniotic innovation did not merely allow one group to outcompete another. It knitted the history of life to new geological narratives: the formation of deserts, the radiation of terrestrial plants, the evolution of herbivory, and the long, tangled path to endothermy and parental care in some lineages. The architecture of the egg, small and efficient, set in motion life, histories that would eventually permit the rise of dinosaurian giants, the mammalian experiments in lactation and warmth, and the eventual cultural elaborations of humans. None of those outcomes were inevitable. They were contingent elaborations on the simple act of enclosing an embryo and letting it breathe. In the hush after that first innovation, the world did not roar. It rearranged. Some lineages flourished, others persisted in refugia. Many experiments left no descendants. The lesson, the narrator gently insists, is both scientific and philosophical. Transformations that appear modest on the surface can be tectonic in outcome. The amniotic egg was a small invention with disproportionate consequences. It turned the land from hostile limit into canvas. The narrative image that lingers is modest. A cracked eggshell on sun-worn soil, a tiny imprint in a leaf litter, a single life stepping into a drier world. From such small passages, the long, complicated story of terrestrial dominance and of the many lives that would eventually look back and ask, "How did we get here?" was written, one fragile egg at a time. What does dominance look like when the planet tightens its seams and the rules of life are being quietly rewritten? That is the thought that opens the Permian chapter. A question about scale, about authority without spectacle, about how certain forms come to command landscapes not by sudden perfection, but by a long sequence of fits and improvisations. The Permian is an epoch in which earlier freedoms of water, of diffuse habitats, of luxuriant swamps begin to narrow. Pangaea pulls continents together. Interior basins bake under a harsher sun. In that contraction, new anatomies and strategies find purchase. Among them are creatures that, to a modern eye, look uncanny. Sail-backed pelycosaurs like Dimetrodon. They are not dinosaurs. They are neither the last nor the simplest actors in the story. They are, instead, emblematic of a world in which reptiles and their synapsid cousins come to define terrestrial authority. The image that will recur throughout this segment is both small and vivid, a pale morning. Mist still clings to a low floodplain where a ditch of slow water runs. The flat silhouette of a sail lifts gradually from the haze. Its thin membranes catch light and shadow across a lattice of elongated neural spines. In that modest tableau are multiple possibilities. Heat exchange, visual signal, a metabolic trick, each an answer to multiple intersecting pressures. The narrator lingers on the ambiguity because the fossil record offers multiple plausible stories. The sail could be a solar panel, allowing an ectothermic body to warm more quickly after cool nights on an exposed Pangaean plain. It could be a social banner display for mate or rival. It could be both. The Permian temperament is one of multi-purpose bricolage. Structures do more than one job because the environment demands versatility. Dimetrodon, often invoked as a classic Permian predator, helps explain what dominance looked like in practice. Its jaw and tooth architecture speak of a lineage experimenting with feeding mechanics, heterodont teeth, differentiated for clutching, slicing, and crushing. Its sprawling posture, heavy skull, and powerful neck muscles suggest a mode of life built around short, decisive encounters. Sudden lunges, strong bites followed by withdrawal to consume slowly at leisure. This is a predator that could exploit a variety of prey, armored amphibians, early reptiles, and perhaps carrion. It occupied an ecological niche that combined strength with opportunism. To reconstruct a hunting tableau is to attend to small details that turn evolutionary inference into a scene. The slow approach across cracked ground, nostrils sampling warm air, a head tilt registering a scent gradient. The suspense in such a scene is not melodramatic violence, but a measured tension. Each movement, a gamble against the unpredictable distribution of prey and the ever-present risk of injury. Opposite the predators were their surveyors and burdens, large herbivores and omnivores, whose bodies were equally adapted to Permian conditions. Edaphosaurus, a distant cousin with a similar sail, fed on tough vegetation and shows how related morphologies could solve for opposing ecological challenges. Parasaurs, compact, heavily ossified herbivores, kept low to the ground with robust skulls and broad teeth able to process fibrous plants. These creatures were ecological anchors, slow-moving, armored, and abundant enough to sustain predator populations. Their life histories: slow growth, heavy investments in defense, perhaps social groupings, are the silent scaffolding upon which top predators operated. The plant world had undergone its own recalibration. The decline of the great coal swamps and the retreat of fern-dominated wetlands made room for seed-bearing plants, conifers, seed ferns, and other gymnosperms that could tolerate seasonality and drier soils. Seeds are small, profound inventions. They encapsulate an embryo with a nutrient reserve and a protective coating that resists desiccation. In the Permian landscape, seeds permitted vegetation to occupy steeper slopes, drier flats, and more seasonal microclimates. The new floras were tougher and often less nutritious per bite than the lush carboniferous peat makers, and herbivores adapted accordingly. Chewing surfaces grew more elaborate, digestive strategies changed, selective pressures pushed toward longer guts, stronger jaw mechanics, and the evolution of plant-specialized dentitions. In this sense, the Permian is a story of co-evolution. Plants altered the available diets and thereby shaped the anatomy of the animals that grazed them. These ecological transformations bred complexity in unexpected places. Insect faunas diversified and specialized. Detritivores became efficient processors of the drier, lignified plant matter, and herbivorous lineages evolved mouthparts capable of slicing tougher tissues. The microecologies of dung, fallen cones, and seed caches became theatres for intricate interactions: fungi, arthropod larvae, small amniotes, all carving out narrow lives. Burrowing behaviours proliferated as well. Where surface conditions could turn hostile with heat or drought, the subterranean refugia offered a biased advantage. A burrow is a microclimate, a time buffer, an evolutionary investment in patience. The fossil record preserves traces, fill patterns, burrow casts that point to these behavioral innovations. Permian life increasingly learned to hide, to bide, and to exploit verticality in the soil column. Therapsids, the lineage on the path to mammals, appear in this narrative as an undercurrent of anatomical refinement. They are not yet mammals, but they display hints of what will later be called mammalian. More erect limb posture in some groups, differentiated teeth with complex occlusion, changes in jaw and ear bones. The tempo of evolution in these lineages is one of morphological experimentation and subtle physiological shifts. The possibility that endothermic traits, insulation, higher metabolic rates, began evolving in small increments in certain therapsids is an open question that animates the Permian story. What must be emphasized is contingency. An anatomical tweak in jaw articulation, an increase in cheek musculature, or a change in tooth shape did not guarantee the emergence of warm-bloodedness, but it opened corridors of potential. Large-scale geology is, as always, the vast context against which these biological narratives are read. Pangaea's vast interior experienced extreme seasonality. Mountain ranges and arid basins reconfigured precipitation regimes. Rivers ran more episodically, lakes dried in summer and refilled in storms. The denudation of the former swampy lowlands released soils and nutrients in different patterns, reshaping coastal environments and shallow marine shelves. This continental reorganization was not mere backdrop, it was an actor shaping selection pressure. As niches contracted and expanded across the supercontinent, populations were repeatedly bottlenecked, isolated, and later reunited. An evolutionary pump that both created novelty and hardened specialization. Such specialization produced both power and fragility. The Permian titans, large-bodied, regionally dominant reptiles and synapsids, embodied effective solutions to the new conditions: robust feeding apparatus, defensive armor, thermoregulatory sails, and efficient reproductive strategies. Yet specialization is a contract with circumstance. When the planet's chemistry and climate altered on an astronomically larger scale, those contracts unraveled. The end of the Permian is rendered in the fossil record as a sudden, brutal recalibration. The cause is multifactorial, but a leading hypothesis centers on massive, protracted volcanism. The Siberian traps, releasing enormous volumes of greenhouse gases, toxic aerosols, and heat into the atmosphere. The result was cascading, rapid warming, ocean stratification and the spread of anoxic waters, acidification of shallow seas, collapse of primary productivity in many regions, and dramatic shifts in terrestrial climates. For the Permian titans, these changes were catastrophic. Food webs collapsed as primary producers faltered. The finely tuned physiologies of many large vertebrates could not cope with rapid thermal stress and oxygen depletion. The signature of extinction is both sudden and patchy. Rock layers abruptly lose the familiar assemblages and become populated by a diminished, reorganized faunal mix. The image that closes the extinction sequence is stark, a horizon line marked by a die-off, a charcoal layer, a sudden paucity of shells and bones where once abundance lay. The emotional contour of this chapter is a slow-building tension that crescendos into melancholy. Dominance in the Permian was achieved through 100 small selections. Shell here, sail there, a tighter jaw, a seed that travels farther. Each is unglamorous individually. Together they produced a world in which certain bodies seemed inevitable. The extinction upends that sense of inevitability. It is a reminder that success in deep time is provisional. The narrator does not moralize. Instead, the voice is quietly philosophical. The planet is patient, and it returns any favor offered it by life with interest. Those interests are indifferent. To render the Permian in documentary scenes is to dwell in particulars. One might imagine a herd of pariasaurs moving between stands of low conifers, grinding tough cones and dropping droppings that feed insect colonies beneath the litter. A dimetrodon appears on a ridge, scanning the plain with a head that moves in precise, efficient increments, its sail-catching morning sun, perhaps thermoregulating, perhaps sending a signal to compact a social network. Nearby, a therapsid delves into the soft soil of a burrow, sensitive to the faint vibration of distant storms. Each vignette is quiet, domestic, full of tiny risks. A juvenile fails to find shelter before a sudden heat spike. A seasonal drought kills off a plant cohort. A river changes course overnight. These are the moments that, when multiplied and repaid by geological time, write the larger narrative. The Permian chapter ends with a fossil tableau, slabs of sandstone and mudstone bearing perfectly preserved impressions. Teeth marks in bone, the sculpted plate of a pariasaur's skull, the thin striated impressions of a sail. Above this tableau lies the boundary ash, an abrupt chemical and textural change that reads as a punctuation mark in the rock. The narrator lets the image sit, and then folds back to the central thought. That dominance in deep time is always provisional, a negotiation between anatomy and environment, between innovation and accident. If there is a final resonant lesson, it is modest but penetrating. The Permian titans remind us that power arises through fit, not fate. anatomical extravagances. The sails, the heavy skulls, the armored hides are answers to very particular contexts. When the context reconfigures, those answers can become liabilities. The Permian thus serves as both eulogy and warning. A chapter full of monumental life forms, of palpable authority, and of sudden unmaking. It is an episode in which the planet shows, with stark clarity, that its history is a ledger of exchange, and that no reign, however well adapted, is permanent in the slow reckoning of deep time. What if silence could be counted, not as the absence of sound, but as a metric of life taken away? That is the unsettling image that opens the Great Dying, a planet so altered that the usual noises of ecosystems, the rasp of feeding, the slap of fins, the chorus of insects recede into a new baseline of emptiness. It is not a dramatic blackout in the human sense, it is a geological recalibration, a subtraction performed on a timescale that outlasts seasons and civilizations. In 205.2 million years before the present, Earth kept its slow, cold tally and arrived at a ledger entry marked in ash and poisoned water, a loss so large it rewrote the rules by which future life would gamble. The story begins with a familiar set of players from the Permian stage, sprawling supercontinents, interior basins baked by sun and season, great herds and predators balanced on long contingent ecologies. Pangaea's interior had already narrowed habitats, concentrating floras and faunas into mosaic refugia. Against that background, something changed in ways both geological and atmospheric. Vast, mantle-driven eruptions opened across what would later be Siberia, the Siberian Traps, flooding the land with basalt and sending plume after plume of gas into the sky. It was not one horrendous eruption, but a protracted episode, a planetary cough that refused to subside. Over tens of thousands of years, the volcanoes became a chemical orchestra, belching carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, halogens, and particulates. Their emissions were the proximate cause of a cascade, greenhouse warming, acid rain, ocean stratification, and the release of methane from trapped hydrates. A feedback loop that amplified itself with brutal efficiency. To render that cascade in human-scale terms, the narrator invites close attention to a few scenes. One is the ocean's skin, usually a place of shimmer and exchange, becoming an eruptive chemistry set. Surface waters warmed, stratification intensified, oxygen-poor layers grew thicker and spread. Where currents once mixed, they stalled. Microbial communities thrived under these new gradients. Sulfate-reducing bacteria proliferated, turning water into chemical darkness punctuated by hydrogen sulfide, a poison that suffocated gills and corroded shells. Reef frameworks that had once been cities of calcium carbonate slumped like collapsed architecture. Coral-like builders, sponges, and stromatoporoids choked as their metabolic engines failed. The fossil record preserves those collapses as abrupt horizons, reef rubble, ash-laden layers, and a sudden scarcity where previously there had been abundance. Another scene takes place on land. Sulphurous plumes riding atmospheric currents converted into acid rains that fell across vast stretches of Pangaea. Forest canopies, already stressed by shifting climates, softened and browned at the edges. Fires, stoked by increased dryness and the flammability of oxygen-enriched pockets, raced across peat and leaf litter, leaving behind charcoal-rich strata that become geologic bookmarks. Rivers, where they still flowed, carried acidified waters into estuaries and continental shelves, compounding the marine crisis. The chemistry of soils changed. Microbial decomposers that had kept forest floors cycling began to fail in pockets, altering nutrient flows in ways that would ripple for millennia. These are vivid scenes, not because they are individual tragedies, but because they cumulate. The narrative tension is not a single climactic moment, but a series of convergent stresses that together become catastrophic. Climate warms, and with warming comes both increased weather volatility and decreased oxygen solubility in water. Warming melts, hydrate clathrates, and releases methane impulses. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas that accelerates warming and, in doing so, further reduces oxygen in the seas. The planet's self-regulatory feedbacks, those slow chemical buffers that usually restore balance, became overwhelmed. The result was an ecological unraveling on a scale that dwarfs any single extinction event before or after. The numbers are blunt and almost numbing. More than 90% of marine species and an enormous fraction of terrestrial forms were lost. The seas lost entire faunas of brachiopods, rugose corals, and many ammonoid lineages. On land, dominant synapsids and many amphibian groups disappeared from large tracts of the map. Yet within those numbers lie textures and surprises. Some groups that seemed marginal before the catastrophe, small generalized burrowers, fossorial forms, freshwater-tolerant taxa, persisted. Microbial communities adapted quickly to the new chemical regimes and, in many places, replaced more complex ecosystems as the primary agents of primary production. Life, it must be emphasized, did not simply end wholesale. It changed in composition, scale, and tempo. There is a particular poignancy to the kinds of survivors that later lineages would inherit. Widespread small-bodied synapsids, animals ancestral to the mammalian line, endured in pockets through flexibility and refuge in microhabitats. Terrestrial taxa with low metabolic demands or with life stages sheltered in burrows fared better than those requiring stable, oxygen-rich waters. Marine life was, in some ways, crueler. Organisms dependent on oxygenated shallow shelves fared particularly poorly as anoxic waters expanded. But even in the sea, odd survivors persisted. Hardy bivalves that could tolerate low oxygen, opportunistic ammonoids that radiated later in the Triassic, and microbial mats that stitched together the first food webs of the early recovery. The narrator dwells on one microcosm to make the scale palpable. Imagine a coastal reef over a few centuries, its edge colonized by chemosynthetic microbial mats. As oxygen declines, soft-bodied organisms replaced by sulfide-tolerant bacteria forming microbialites that trap sediment into laminae. Carbonate precipitation becomes localized and unusual as ocean chemistry flips. The living reef as a habitat collapses, and in its place, for a time, microbial carpets dominate. This image is crucial because it shows extinction not as total annihilation, but as a reconfiguration of ecological actors, microbes replacing animals, biochemical pathways replacing food chains. The planet, in effect, swapped its caste lists. That swap had deep consequences for evolutionary trajectories. With the old dominant forms gone, ecological space opened, and new possibilities became accessible. The Triassic world did not immediately bloom into abundance. It was a slow, sometimes fitful recovery measured in millions of years. But the blank slate allowed different lineages to experiment with body plans and behaviors that had been previously marginalized. Archosaurs, ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, found new opportunities and began to diversify. Small synapsid lineages that made it through the crisis, synodonts among them, continued an evolutionary thread that, over immense spans of time, would be refined into the mammalian condition. In this sense, the Great Dying functions paradoxically as both a terminus and a prologue. It removed the dominant chapters and created the conditions for a different set of narratives to be written. The emotional tone the narrator cultivates here is a mix of sober grief and restrained wonder. Grief, because the fossil record is full of losses that feel personal when examined closely. Entire ecosystems erased, lineages ended, the particularities of ancient ecologies rendered silent. Wonder, because the aftermath reveals the resilience and inventiveness of life at scales that defy easy intuition. The Great Dying is not teleological. It does not cause mammals or dinosaurs by design. Instead, it clears and reshapes the stage so that when new actors eventually arrive, they do so under different constraints and with different opportunities. The narrator insists on contingency. Had volcanism been of different magnitude, had methane hydrates not been poised for release, had continents been arrayed differently, the outcomes could have been altered. This contingency is not an abstract philosophical point, but a practical one. Deep time history is a series of possibilities realized or foreclosed by the particulars of geology and chemistry. There are granular vignettes that bring the catastrophe's reality into focus. Charred plant beds mark regions where fires ran along peat-rich floors. Thin horizons of volcanic ash cap, sedimentary sequences, and signal abrupt changes in deposition. Isotopic excursions in carbonate. Rocks indict the massive perturbations in carbon cycling. A sudden proliferation of microbialites testifies to the dramatic shifts in ecological dominance. Each of these signals is a somber vignette, a line of evidence that, taken together, form a multi-proxy indictment of a planet in crisis. The recovery phase is a study in patience. Initial rebounds are patchy and dominated by opportunistic species. Triassic seas, for example, saw the rise of new ammonoid clades that recolonized niches previously held by groups now extinct. Bivalves diversified into forms that occupied new ecological roles. Certain echinoderm groups reappeared in altered guises. Terrestrial ecosystems gradually reassembled. Early archosaurs diversified into forms that probed terrestrial and aerial niches, while synapsids eked out continued existence in smaller forms, adopting niches of nocturnality, burrowing and insectivorous strategies that would prove advantageous in unstable post-extinction landscapes. The narrator stresses that the Great Dying is instructive for how ecosystems reboot after massive disturbance. Recovery is not a simple return to a prior state. Instead, it is a trajectory to a new equilibrium, with different dominants and different energetic architectures. The food webs that reconstituted themselves in the Triassic had different keystone species and new top-down and bottom-up controls. In ecological terms, extinction reshuffled the deck and dealt a new hand. There is also an ethical clarity to this deep time meditation that the voice avoids weaponizing but makes available as reflection. The planet's capacity for sudden, systemic change is real and dramatic. The geological processes that drove the Permian-Triassic extinction were of a scope beyond human activity, yet the mechanisms, greenhouse forcing, ocean deoxygenation, biogeochemical feedbacks are familiar. The lesson is one of humility. The Great Dying teaches that living systems exist within physical envelopes and that when those envelopes shift rapidly, ecosystems reorder in ways that can be both destructive and creative. The chapter closes with an image that is at once elegiac and strangely hopeful. Picture a desolate plain just after the worst of the crisis. Ash-grey horizons, a skeletal horizon of broken shell and pockets of life, low, scrappy, microbial and small-bodied, beginning to recolonize. Among them, a burrower slips beneath a patch of scrub that survived in a sheltered hollow. A hardy clam filters murky sulfide-laced water and manages to reproduce. A small cynodont nibbles tubers in the dimness. These are not triumphant icons, they are pragmatic survivors. In their persistence lies the seed of future diversification. The Great Dying, the narrator concludes, was the most catastrophic culling the planet has recorded, but it was also a radical clearing. From that clearing came new possibilities, different actors, different rules, and, in time, the slow accretion of complexity that would make room for mammals, for dinosaurs, and for all the later chapters of life's relentless, unpredictable story. What does it mean to rule a world for 165 million years? The question hangs like a geometric shadow across the Mesozoic. A long tenure of forms and strategies that reshaped continents, retooled ecosystems, and left an imprint of scale and persistence so large that later eras would, in comparison, read as brief flickers. The age of dinosaurs begins not with a single triumphant scene, but with a framing thought. Dominance in deep time is less a moment of perfection than a sustained conversation between anatomy, climate, and geography, a conversation that, in this case, lasted for an epochal span. From the vantage of a patient narrator, the Mesozoic reads as a trilogy of experiments. Triassic origins set the first terms. Jurassic opulence extended them into grandeur. Cretaceous refinements altered textures and opened new possibilities. Across those intervals, dinosaurs diversified into ecological roles that in earlier chapters had been occupied by other clades. They did so by elaborating body plans, sauropods stretching necks skyward, theropods refining the mechanics of pursuit and manipulation, ornithischians building defenses and complex chewing systems, and by interacting with a world in the midst of tectonic rearrangement. The breakup of Pangea-carved landmasses into ever more complex theatres, producing islands of isolation and corridors of dispersal, that biased evolution in predictable and unpredictable ways. The first impression, unavoidable and necessary, is one of scale. Sauropods like Brachiosaurus embodied a new answer to the problem of feeding and energy economy. Make body volume vast, neck length prodigious, and use a skeletal architecture lightened by pneumatic cavities to move a mass that seemed to defy ordinary constraints. The narrator pauses on anatomical detail. The vertebrae were latticed with air chambers, ribs and girdles distributed weight in a choreography of tensile and compressive forces. Tooth batteries were reduced to pegs and spatulate blades in some lineages because bulk processing of plant matter relied on fermentation and long guts rather than on high-precision chewing. Each anatomical choice read as an economic decision across millions of years. Energy invested in growth in exchange for dominance at the level of biomass and seed dispersal. The ability to access foliage other herbivores could not, and the capacity to alter landscapes by trampling and browsing. These herbivores did not live in isolation. Their presence structured communities. Herding in large-bodied dinosaurs created patterns of vegetation dynamics, soil disturbance, and nutrient redistribution that had ecosystem scale effects. Where herds moved, they opened gaps in forest canopies, creating microclimates for understory plants and for invertebrate communities. Their dung became islands of fertility, attracting beetles, carrion feeders, and decomposers whose activities married nutrient cycles across trophic levels. The fossil record supplies traces, trackways crossing mudflats in parallel lines, nested nests preserved in ash, clusters of gastroliths associated with long cervical series that allow the narrator to rehearse small, intimate scenes. An adult lowering a head to strip conifer twigs, young ones gambolling in the lee of a massive flank, the slow grinding of vegetation as a background rhythm to a continent's day. Carnivores offer a different register of the Mesozoic's dramaturgy. Theropods refined predatory mechanics over tens of millions of years, moving along a spectrum from gracile, fast hunters to massive apex predators. Tyrannosaurus rex, the late Cretaceous apex, compressed massive bite force into a skull architecture that combined bone robustness with muscular leverage. Its teeth were designed for shearing and bone crushing. Its senses, olfaction, binocular vision, were honed into a perceptual toolkit that made it a formidable presence on the landscape. Yet dominance was not monolithic. Small, feathered theropods, the ancestors of birds, show how the same broad lineage explored alternative solutions: insulation, display, and ultimately flight. Feathers themselves, as the narrator emphasizes, were not born for flight, but for thermoregulation and signaling. Their later co-option for aerodynamic use is an archetypal example of evolutionary tinkering. The skies and seas of the Mesozoic were companion stages to terrestrial dramas. Pterosaurs carved the air long before birds achieved powered flight, and their wing architectures, membranous, supported by elongate digits, produced an aerial fauna that ranged from the size of modern gulls to forms with wingspans rivaling small aircraft. In the oceans, reptiles reasserted a lineage that earlier eras had already explored. Plesiosaurs, broad-bodied swimmers with long necks or small heads and powerful flippers, patrolled continental shelves and open seas with a locomotion that read as elegant and alien. 4 large hydrofoil-like paddles coordinating in a swimming stroke that turned water into a responsive medium. In the late Cretaceous, mosasaurs derived from land-lapping squamates became apex marine predators, their bodies elongated, tails laterally compressed for thrust, and jaws bearing rows of recurved teeth that could grasp and slice. The oceans, like the continents, were arenas of arms races, armor, speed, and sensory specializations traded places as selective advantages. Plant life changed the stage beneath those bodies. For much of the Mesozoic, gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, and ginkgos dominated the vegetation. Their structural and chemical features biased the diets and digestive strategies of herbivores. But the Cretaceous saw the rise of angiosperms, flowering plants, and with them a cascade of coevolutionary consequences. Flowers altered pollination ecologies, attracting insects in novel ways and reshaping food webs. Leaves diversified in form and chemistry, fruits began to appear as high-calorie rewards that favored certain seed dispersers. The narrator dwells on the subtlety, an innovation that in isolation might appear minor. A novel reproductive structure became, through ecological feedbacks, a driver of diversification among insects, herbivores, and the predators that tracked them. Flowering plants changed landscapes within the span of tens of millions of years, creating refugia and new selection pressures for both small and large taxa. Behavioral complexity increases the narrative density. Evidence for parental care nests arranged in colonies, eggs incubated in mounded sediments, bones of juvenile dinosaurs found in association with adults allows the narrator to sketch scenes of tender, cautious interactions without resorting to anthropomorphism. Such behaviors altered survival curves. Species that invested in fewer, larger offspring with more parental provisioning were playing a different life-history game from those that produced numerous, unprotected eggs. Social structures too varied widely. Flocking behaviors could confer protection, while solitary ambush predation favored stealth and surprise. The fossil records patches of preserved behavior, trackways that register speed changes, path crossings and abrupt turns, are the documentary footage the narrator uses to reconstruct the rhythms of daily life. Anatomy and physiology remain central puzzles. Debate about dinosaur metabolism. Were they ectothermic, endothermic, or somewhere between? Is not merely academic, it determines how these animals lived and how they could sustain growth, activity, and survivorship across seasons. The narrator resists simple slogans and instead lays out evidence. Rapid growth rates inferred from bone histology suggest elevated metabolic investments in many lineages. The presence of feathers and insulating integuments in numerous theropods implies warmth retention strategies. Yet gigantothermy, where very large bodies maintain stable internal temperatures by virtue of volume, offers another route to thermostasis for giant sauropods. The point is not to adjudicate a single answer, but to convey the plurality of strategies evolution can generate when energy budgets, body size, and climate interact over geological time. The Mesozoic was also a story of geography. As continents drifted, faunas were split, recombined, and isolated. Gondwana's southern landmasses fostered lineages of sauropods that developed distinct morphologies, while Laurasian forests nurtured different suites of theropods and ornithischians. Island ecosystems produced dwarfed forms and peculiar specializations. Plate tectonics was not mere background, it was an agent of evolutionary contingency, partitioning gene pools and sculpting climates in ways that biased evolutionary outcomes. The narrator emphasizes contingency repeatedly. Isolation begets endemism, contact begets competition. Chance fracture lines in Earth's crust can redirect the possibilities of life for tens of millions of years. There is an aesthetic to the Mesozoic that the voice of reflective documentary storytelling must capture, a feeling of both abundance and ritualized risk. Predation was a constant, but not the only sculptor of form. Disease, climate oscillations, volcanic episodes, and sea level changes repeatedly reconfigured habitats. Evolutionary innovation, feathered insulation, pneumatic skeletons, complex chewing apparatuses did not guarantee permanence. Rather, innovation provided new ways to occupy niches and to survive in an ever-shifting world. The narrator inserts, without sensationalism, a foreshadowing note. No reign in deep time is unchallengeable. The long dominance of dinosaurs is a ledger entry, impressive in duration and effect, but it is part of a larger pattern in which planetary chemistry, celestial perturbations, and geological happenstances can, with sufficient force, redraw the map of life. The age of dinosaurs, majestic and varied, is therefore both an apex and a preparation for the rise of birds, for the later flowering of mammals in the niches left by those that vanish, and for a planetary history that alternates long flourishing with sudden upheaval. To close the segment, the narrator offers a composite tableau meant to bind the particular with the philosophical. Imagine a floodplain at the end of a hot day. Brachiosaurus necks reach like living cranes into a canopy of conifers. Herds of hadrosaurs murmur along a riverbank, their grinding dental batteries working like slow mills. A small band of feathered theropods darts across an open patch, their plumage catching light. Offshore, a plesiosaur glides beneath surface ripples, and high above, a pterosaur's silhouette slices the dusk. The repository of tracks, nests, and bones beneath that plain sediment, layered and rewoven through years and storms, becomes a record of persistence. The image is meant to conjure awe, but also humility, a reminder that dominance in deep time is the result not of a single genius, but of countless small alignments between living bodies and the planetary systems that sustain them. This, the narrator concludes, is the essential lesson of the Mesozoic. The dinosaurs' long reign was a sustained negotiation with the world's shifting canvases. An era in which form and function were explored at extreme scales, in which ecosystems rewired themselves around new architectures of size and behavior, and in which life's capacity for invention was matched by the planet's capacity for change. The Age of Dinosaurs reads as both a statement of power and a study in fragility, a chapter that insists on grandeur yet remains a piece of a larger, unpredictable narrative. What does an end look like when it arrives in a single, incandescent punctuation mark, and yet writes its consequences into rock for tens of millions of years? That question frames the last act of the Mesozoic, a sudden, planet-scale perturbation that collapsed accustomed ecologies and, in doing so, cleared a stage for new actors. The endod-Cretaceous boundary is not merely the story of a rock meeting a globe, it is the story of how contingency and scale interact, how an instantaneous physical shock bleeds into protracted biological collapse, and how the small, those forms that had long lived in margins and microhabitats, are the ones that inherit a radically changed world. The catastrophe begins in minutes and unfolds across epochs. A bolide, several tens of kilometers wide, struck the Yucatan Peninsula, where the Chicxulub crater would be left as a scar in the crust. The immediate physics is brutal and unfamiliar. An impact that vaporized rock sent a column of incandescent debris into suborbital trajectories and generated a shockwave whose initial pressure was capable of felling trees at continental distances. Energy release on that timescale resembled the instantaneous unmaking of local geographies, melted crust, pyroclastic fountains, and tsunamis that raced across shallow continental shelves. But the real planetary violence was accomplished not only by the moment of collision, but by the atmospheric chemistry it set into motion. Within hours and days, the atmosphere turned hostile in several ways. Ejecta lofted high into the stratosphere radiated heat on re-entry, igniting fires across vast regions. Soot and ash, mingled with sulfate aerosols released from vaporized rocks, blanketed the sky. Photosynthetically active radiation collapsed. Sunlight was reduced to a weak, reddish glow or cut off entirely in many regions for months to years. In the oceans, surface cooling and a shutdown of sunlight translated into a collapse of phytoplankton productivity, the foundational engine of marine food webs, so that suspension feeders, planktivores, and the carnivores that depended upon them found their energetic scaffolding removed. On land, plants faltered, leaves browned, seedlings failed to establish, and ecosystems quietly unraveled from the bottom up. The physical markers of that catastrophe are sharp in the stratigraphic ledger. A centimetre-thin heart of clay, rich in iridium far above background levels, appears in sediments around the globe, an anomalous fingerprint of extraterrestrial material. Shocked quartz and microtektites pepper the layer, and immediately above it, a fern spike in palynological records documents the first wave of vegetational recovery. Ferns and other simple colonizers that can exploit nutrient-rich, disturbed soils proliferated where more complex forests had burned or collapsed. These are not poetic images, they are empirical signatures of an abrupt planet-wide reset. The biological consequences are both immediate and lagged. Some organisms perished within hours. Those in the direct vicinity of impact, those at the sea surface suffering from thermal pulses, those sensitive to rapid acidification or sulfide invasion. Others succumbed slowly over months to years as food webs lost their base. The extinction pattern is strikingly selective. Non-Vavian dinosaurs, the vast, ecologically dominant vertebrates that had ruled terrestrial realms for over 100 million years, vanished in the record with remarkable ubiquity. Their disappearance is not the outcome of a single biological weakness easily summarized. It is the product of life histories and ecological dependencies that created systemic vulnerability. Large-bodied predators and herbivores with long generation times, specialized diets, and dependence on extensive plant communities were especially at risk when the primary productivity that supported their trophic level collapsed. By contrast, certain lineages survived, and their survival is as instructive as any extinction. The immediate survivors were seldom the conspicuous giants. Instead, Resilience was clustered in smallness, generalism, refuge use, and ecological flexibility. Avian lineages, the descendants of a subset of Maniraptoran theropods, persisted. Their survival likely owed to a mix of traits. Many were small, volant, or at least arboreal, and the ability to exploit seeds, insects, and small prey provided dietary breadth when dominant plant communities faltered. Small mammals, already modest players through much of the Mesozoic, likewise persisted. Their habits, nocturnality, burrowing, and an omnivorous palate served as ecological lifelines. Burrows and cavities offered insulation from the thermal blast and buffered against the worst of the fiery storms. A diet that included seeds, insects, and detritus could be maintained even as primary productivity crashed. Low, absolute requirements for caloric intake per individual, faster reproductive cycles, and flexible behaviors translated into demographic resilience when the world's high A biomass players failed. The immediate aftermath was a world of strange light and uneasy chemistry. Days and weeks after the impact, a global winter set in. Surface cooling, as sunlight remained attenuated by aerosols and debris. With diminished photosynthesis came cascading declines in herbivorous populations, then in predators. Oceans stratified, oxygen dissolved from deeper layers, anoxic zones widened, smothering benthic communities. For many lineages, the challenge was not instantaneous death, but the slow attrition of reproductive success across generations. For others, such as many planktonic foraminifera and ammonites, the result was near total loss. Coral reefs, intricate communities that require stable chemical conditions and steady calcification, largely collapsed. The marine biota that had produced sumptuous reef cities for millions of years found those foundations destabilized. Yet extinction is not merely subtraction. In the spaces left behind, life reconfigured. Microbial communities exploited the altered chemistry. Opportunistic bacteria and algae proliferated in regions where more complex food webs had receded. On land, the fern spike marks the primary colonizers, simple plants whose ecology suited them to disturbed, sunlit soils in which nutrient pulses from ash and char were momentarily abundant. These organisms stabilized soils, allowed other plants to establish, and in a few million years the vegetational structure shifted again, permitting the slow return of more woody taxa. The ecological vacancy created by the loss of major vertebrate clades allowed those survivors, birds, mammals, crocodilians, among others, to expand into new niches, to explore diets and behaviors that had previously been closed by competition. This is where the narrative turns from catastrophe to contingency. The endemic Cretaceous event did not select for some anticipated outcome, it rerouted evolutionary trajectories. The Mesozoic's long durée of dinosaurian dominance does not imply inevitability in terrestrial evolution. Instead, fate hinged on 1,000 local interactions. Which burrows were deep enough to protect embryos from incandescent fallout? Which species could subsist on seeds and detritus for seasons? Which mobile flyers could cross depleted landscapes to find refugia? Those microecological contingencies, stacked upon the global physics of impact, produced the macroscopic pattern mass extinction, coupled with selective survival. There is a philosophical cadence to this turn. The extinction reads as a reminder that dominance is precarious, that evolutionary success depends as much on the handshake between life history and environment as on morphology alone. Giants can rule for epochs but be undone in a geological heartbeat by environmental reconfiguration. Smallness, in the right circumstances, can be a virtue. The survivors were often those whose lives were lived at a different scale. Underground, undercover, and in niches the great beasts had not fully occupied. That scale is a recurrent theme across Earth's deep history. The patient accumulation of marginal strategies can matter most when the world is broken open. The Cape Peak boundary also invites a cautious reflection on contingency versus directionality in evolution. The extinction cleared room for mammalian diversification, but it did not make mammals inevitable rulers by some teleological decree. Instead, the removal of incumbents opened adaptive landscapes. Over the subsequent epochs, mammals would diversify dramatically in body size, dietary specialization, and ecological roles. Birds would radiate into forms from apex aerial predators to seed specialists and long-distance migrants. Yet none of those futures were guaranteed by the impact alone. They were the products of subsequent innovation, of changing climates, continental rearrangements, and new co-evolutionary interactions with evolving floras and faunas. Rich detail anchors the narrative in humanly apprehensible scenes without inventing characters. Imagine the air after the fires, thick with soot, the horizon a murky sheet, ash-like grey snow settling into wetlands and river deltas. In coastal shallows, fish and invertebrates drift in dying swarms as oxygen levels plummet. Inland, forests blacken, trunks smoulder beneath a sky that denies warmth. In a sunken valley, the first colonizers, ferns, and certain resilient angiosperms send up erect fronds into an alien luminescence. Here and there, the chirp and flutter of surviving birds punctuate the muted world, their songs are small anomalies in a hushed planet. Below the surface, in burrows and crevices, small mammals persist. Physiological necessities met by careful rationing, by diets that scavenge what remains, by reproductive strategies tuned to fast generation times. These are not individual dramas to dramatize, but ecological vignettes that, multiplied by millions, compose the larger reset. The geological record records a long tail. The world did not snap back to pre-impact conditions in a season. Recovery unfolded over hundreds of thousands to millions of years, with repeated oscillations in climate and chemistry. The initial global winter gave way to longer-term greenhouse warming as carbon dioxide and methane concentrations rose with both impact-released gases and subsequent volcanism. Marine anoxia persisted in pulses. Ecosystems shifted into new equilibriums, and with the new actors came new possibilities. Mammals becoming nocturnal specialists, and then diurnal generalists. Birds evolving novel foraging strategies and flight mechanics. Plants diversifying into new forms and aromas that would, over time, shape pollinator evolution. The emotional tone of this chapter is deliberately mixed, somber at the scale of loss, quietly fascinated at the scale of recovery. The planet is indifferent to suffering, yet life is rhetorically resilient. In the hush after the impact's immediate violence, the Earth's biosphere reconfigured itself not through acts of will, but through the patient arithmetic of survival and reproduction. The end of one era was the beginning of another, but that beginning was not tidy or teleological. It was a messy sequence of opportunistic colonizations, demographic luck, and the slow drift of selection in new ecological contexts. If there is a concluding image, it is a paradoxical one, a thin, blackened horizon capped by iridium-rich clay, a single, sharp line in the rock marking sudden change, and beneath that line, the faint, persistent heartbeat of small lives. In that paused moment, the planet registers both the drama of a catastrophic punctuation and the quieter fact that life, as a process, privileges continuity. Birds would go on, mammals would prepare themselves, anatomically and behaviorally, for a long, patient radiation. The end of the dinosaurs was, in geological shorthand, a preface. A clearing of an ancient stage that would, slowly and contingently, become the theatre for mammalian and avian diversification. The lesson of that boundary is as much about humility as it is about resilience. In deep time, scale and contingency conspire to make the improbable inevitable, and the smallest strategies can prove the most durable when the world is made strange. What, then, remains when bodies that once crowded seas and forests have gone to stone and dust? The answer is not a single relic, but a layered archive. Fossils pressed into sedimentary pages, isotopic signatures trapped in carbonate veins, biomolecules folded into mineral lattices, and the silent script of DNA molecular palimpsests that preserve, in coded shorthand, chapters of lives long vanished. The legacy of the ancients is not only what is visible in museums or cliffsides, it is the invisible inheritance embedded in every cell of modern life. In that inheritance are gestures of survival, traces of extinction, and the slow, patient accumulation of contingency that produced what exists now. Fossils are the obvious evidence, shells turned to stone, bones mineralized and aligned, impressions of body outlines fossilized in clay. Yet the fossil record is not a complete book. It is an edited anthology, biased by the chemistry and mechanics of preservation. Mineralized skeletons and hard parts are overrepresented. Soft-bodied creatures, delicate tissues, and ephemeral behaviors are rarely conserved. Where preservation was generous, a storm burying a reef, a volcanic ash rain encasing a forest floor, the record acquires fidelity. A snapshot, sometimes astonishingly precise, of anatomy and interaction. But many chapters are lost between such moments. The paleontological voice is therefore one of careful interpolation, reading staggered sentences and inferring the paragraphs that connected them. Deeper than shape is chemistry. Isotopic ratios. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen are fingerprints of ancient environments. The ratios of carbon-12 to carbon-13 in organic deposits carry the signature of photosynthetic pathways and of the types of plants that dominated a landscape. Oxygen isotopes in shell carbonate reveal paleotemperatures and the salinity of ancient seas. Layers rich in particular elements tell of volcanic episodes, of ocean anoxia, or of pulses of organic burial. These geochemical archives let the narrator reconstruct not only forms, but climates, energetic flows, and the stresses that shaped evolutionary trajectories. In the stone, one finds not only the bodies of creatures, but the weather those bodies endured. A more intimate and surprising archive is molecular. Proteins can persist in deep time under exceptional conditions. Collagen fragments have been recovered from bones tens of millions of years old, their sequences hinting at relationships and physiology long lost. Even more fleeting, fragments of ancient DNA survive in permafrost, in sealed caves, and in deep, cold sediments. Though DNA is fragile and its temporal window of survival is narrow when measured in geological terms. Environmental DNA, the trace of organisms deposited into soils and sediments, has become a revolutionary tool. It captures the presence of species whose bodies left no durable skeleton, records plant communities in locales where wood and pollen would otherwise vanish, and reveals transient inhabitants of ecosystems. Such molecular traces are faint whispers across epochs, but when multiple whispers converge, they form a chorus that clarifies who lived where, eating what, and how communities rearranged through catastrophe and recovery. Perhaps the most profound molecular legacy is written inside the genomes of living organisms. DNA is at once a record of lineage and a repository of ancient innovations. Deep within modern genomes sit sequences that are older than the species that carry them. Hox genes that orchestrate body plans, developmental toolkits that were assembled in the deep pre-Cambrian and then redeployed, refined, and recombined across eons. The same genetic modules that shaped a segmented worm or an early arthropod are the distant relatives of genes that pattern mammalian limbs and the vertebrate brain. These genetic continuities refute a naive sense of rupture. Evolution is a palimpsest in which old texts are overwritten but never wholly erased. The architecture of life is therefore both cumulative and conservative. What appears as novelty is usually a reconfiguration of existing parts. Retroviruses provide a striking example of how the past lodges itself in the molecular present. Ancient viral infections inserted genetic material into germ lines. Over successive generations, these insertions became endogenous retroviruses, molecular fossils that litter vertebrate genomes. Some of these remnants were repurposed. A dramatic case is the origin of syncytin, a viral envelope protein co-opted in mammals to mediate cell fusion during placenta formation. The placenta, an organ central to mammalian reproductive strategy, thus bears the echo of ancient viral encounters. It is a vivid illustration of how what once was pathogenic became instrumental, a theme repeated in myriad small ways across the genomes of living taxa. Mitochondria and chloroplasts articulate an even older and more consequential co-option. The endosymbiotic events that gave rise to these organelles. Cells incorporating once free bacteria are genetic fossils writ large. The circular genomes retained within mitochondria and plastids are relics of those symbioses. Their sequences anchor molecular clocks that allow scientists to estimate divergence times, to place ancient radiations in a temporal frame. These integrations changed the energetic possibilities for cells, enabling more complex multicellularity, greater metabolic power, and, ultimately, nervous systems capable of coordinating bodies in motion. That cellular history is embedded in every eukaryotic cell today. It is a legacy that undergirds the entire edifice of macroscopic life. Yet not all genetic legacies are neatly adaptive. Bottlenecks and mass extinctions leave scars in genomic diversity. Regions of reduced variation, signs of past population collapses, and sweeps where a once rare allele became fixed because of chance survival. The Great Dying at the end of the Permian, the KPG impact at the end of the Cretaceous, both reorganized gene pools. Survivorship was often a matter of scale and habit. Small body size, generalist diets, burrowing behavior, and rapid reproductive cycles conferred advantages when ecosystems imploded. These ecological biases shaped the phylogenetic survivors whose genomes today carry the echoes of narrowed genealogies. Modern mammals and birds, for instance, carry within their DNA the imprint of the selective sieves of mass extinctions, expansions and contractions that left both losses and the raw material for future radiations. Beyond genome sequences, epigenetic marks and developmental plasticity carry a different sort of legacy, the capacity to respond flexibly to environments within an individual's lifetime and across generations. Some epigenetic modifications are transient, but others can prime lineages for rapid adjustment during stressful environmental transitions. The fossil record hints at episodes where plasticity may have mediated survival at critical junctures. Morphological stasis, punctuated by sudden shifts, developmental programs retooled to exploit new niches. Such plasticity is itself part of the inherited toolkit, a kind of meta-legacy that allows descendant lineages to test new ways of being when the world changes unexpectedly. Ecological legacies are equally important and sometimes less obvious. Large-bodied herbivores of the Pleistocene reshaped vegetation patterns through browsing and trampling. Their extinction altered seed dispersal dynamics, vegetation composition, and even fire regimes. Rivers and floodplains that once were shaped by megafaunal movement changed their sedimentary dynamics. The absence of a particular guild, big browsers or apex predators, does not merely subtract species, it reconfigures ecological networks in ways that propagate through millennia. Contemporary ecosystems often bear the fingerprints of such historical reorganizations. The modern distribution of forests, grasslands, and shrublands can thus be read as an outcome not only of climate and geology, but of the fossilized behaviors of entire vanished ecologies. There are also ghost influences, lineages that left no direct descendants yet supplied critical functions during their time. Ediacaran and Cambrian experiments in body plans produced architectures that later vanished, but that, for a time, structured nutrient cycles and ecological interactions in unique ways. The disappearance of reef-building organisms during mass extinctions, for instance, left structural voids for millions of years, transforming coastlines and sedimentation. The imprint of those ephemeral dominions shows how extinction can open and close corridors of possibility. An innovation may be pivotal in one epoch and irrelevant in the next, but in its moment it can remodel the planet's operating systems. The paleogenomic revolution has deepened these insights. By sequencing ancient DNA where preservation allows, and by reconstructing ancestral proteins through comparative genomics, scientists can now approximate ancient physiologies and even behaviors. Paleoproteomics extracts protein sequences from fossils, offering clues to metabolism and tissue composition. Environmental genomics reconstructs past ecosystems from the sedimentary DNA tracked in lake beds and permafrost. These techniques provide a dynamic view, not merely a static catalogue of extinct species, but a reconstruction of interactions, diets, and climatic tolerances. They reveal, for instance, that mammoths carried microbial communities in their guts adapted to processing coarse forage, that ancient horses shifted diets as grasslands expanded, and that certain pathogen lineages co-migrated with their hosts across continents. Speculative questions arise inevitably. If much of the deep past is erased, soft tissues lost, behaviors unobserved, what unrecognized legacies might still persist? Could chemical anomalies in sedimentary basins carry signatures of complex technologies produced by extinct intelligent agents? The strict geological and chemical frameworks constrain such speculation. Durable artifacts are rare on the timescale of millions of years, and the processes of plate tectonics, weathering, and erosion are unforgiving. Yet the narrator permits a tentative thought. The past can leave subtle, distributed signatures, anomalous isotope ratios, non-natural mineralogical arrangements, or persistent microplastic-like residues if technologies were plastic-based and globally ubiquitous. Such possibilities are scientifically constrained, but conceptually provocative. They underscore the difficulty of reading short-lived intelligences into deep time without robust, reproducible markers. What is certain and more humbling is that life's legacy is cumulative and imprinted in the most mundane of things. The shape of a bird's beak, the structure of a mammalian tooth, the pattern of an insect wing. Each carries within it a history of ancient pressures and bygone ecosystems. Hox clusters that determine body segmentation, signaling pathways that guide limb outgrowth, metabolic switches that allow organisms to exploit oxygen fluctuations. These are all parts of an inheritance scattered through genomes like cosmic dust. The living are repositories, carrying within them both the triumphs and the tragedies of predecessors. That inheritance confers a moral and philosophical weight. To listen to the legacy of the ancients is to be attentive to scale, to understand that human lives and civilizations are a brief and delicate episode atop a much vaster history. It invites humility, an appreciation that much of what seems permanent is contingent upon narrow bands of planetary chemistry, continental arrangements, and climatic stability. It also offers perspective. The adaptations now available, genomic motifs, developmental plasticity, microbial symbiosis, are not human gifts, but the accumulated bricolage of billions of years. Humanity's capacity to alter planetary systems is unprecedented in its speed and magnitude. But the substrate of that capacity is an inheritance not of technology alone, but of deep biological contingency. The voice that recounts these legacies is not merely scientific, it is contemplative. In the fossils and in the genomes, one can read stories of resilience and fragility, of opportunistic repurposing, of cooperative accidents like endosymbiosis that rewired metabolism. There is a quiet drama in the way life repeatedly engineers new possibilities from old parts. Viruses turned into placental proteins, bacteria folded into organelles, limbs reworked into wings, and gills reshaped into jaws. These are not narratives of purpose, but of tinkering, repeated and patient within constraints set by planetary chemistry and chance. To close the chapter, the final voice in this long documentary, one image returns and holds. Imagine a modern cell. Within its cytoplasm, a mitochondrion pulses, a remnant of an ancient bacterial guest. Its genome murmurs in coded syllables that point to a world before animals, before forests, before eyes. Outside, the landscape is layered with stone, a reef's collapsed architecture, a coal seam formed by a vanished swamp, a charcoal horizon signaling a past firestorm. In the air, isotopes circulate like invisible signatures of what photosynthesized and what burned. And within the DNA of every organism, small sequences, vestigial, repurposed, stubborn, carry forward the experiments of eons. The legacy of the ancients is not a monument, but a living conversation between past and present. It is both a map and a caution. The present is a consequence of innumerable contingencies, and the future will likewise be written in the interplay of life and planet, in the quiet margins and the sudden shocks, in the fossilized breath and the slow, patient script of DNA.